frozen bureaucracy. Hey guys, tonight we gently unravel how an imperial oversight led to glacier ownership. And yes, it's even more bureaucratic than it sounds. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and if you're up for it. Post your location and local time in the comments. Let's see where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself drifting high above the jagged peaks of the Alps, their snow-capped ridges softened by moonlight. There's no wind-up here, just a breathless hush that blankets everything in stillness. Beneath your floating feet lies something curious, a glacier, vast and luminous, like a slow-moving frozen river that's been paused mid-summer. It stretches far beyond the borders printed on your well-worn map, and if you squint hard enough you might notice a flag planted in the ice, a flag of an empire that hasn't existed in over a century. You wouldn't survive long out here. Of course, the temperature is what kindly historians might call unpleasantly fatal. But the real question that should be nibbling at your half-asleep brain right now isn't how cold it is. It's why in the quiet archives of a long-dead empire, someone put ink to paper and said, yes, we'll take the glacier too. The story begins with paper, not snow, not ice, not frostbitten explorers with impressive beards. Paper, that scratchy, slightly yellowed kind that crackles softly as you turn the pages. Back in the late 1800s, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was doing what empires often do when they sense the faint rumbles of eventual collapse. They organized meticulously, almost obsessively. They redrew borders, catalogued census data, issued tax maps, created postal routes, and the shape of every vineyard seemed to get a moment in the imperial spotlight. And somewhere in that whirlpool of ink, maps, stamps, and forgotten ledgers, a glacier quietly slipped in unnoticed. A rather significant chunk of alpine ice massive, glacially slow, but technically, now imperial property. That's right, not conquered. Not claimed after a dramatic mountaintop duel or with a ceremonial flag waving. It was, quite literally, drawn into the empire by accident. Cartographic drift, one might call it. Or, if you're more of a paperwork romantic, perhaps bureaucratic glaciation. Now you might be thinking, surely someone noticed, someone must have looked at a border map and gone, wait, why does that icy bit belong to us? But the answer is as glacial as the object itself. No one noticed for decades, because it turns out glaciers are very quiet neighbors. They don't throw parties, they don't pay taxes, they don't riot or send letters of complaint. And when you're an empire juggling dozens of ethnic groups, a few scattered uprisings, some inconvenient wars, and an emperor who writes melancholy diary entries about clocks and pigeons, well, you don't tend to prioritize the land that mooshes around a little and keeps freezing your boots. Yet here it was, officially documented. Somewhere in the imperial archives sat a binding recognition that a glacier, specifically nestled in what is now the Alpine border between Austria, Italy, and Switzerland, was under the jurisdiction of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Not just an association, ownership. Imagine walking into your backyard tomorrow and realizing you've legally owned the moon this entire time, and no, it didn't bring you rent. It just sat there, cold and quiet, while your neighbors debated who was supposed to shovel it. What's fascinating is that even now, historians debate whether this ownership was deliberate, a clerical error, or a strategic move disguised as mundane documentation. Some argue that the military may have intended if the glacier could serve as a defensible high ground or at least a buffer between regions. Others point to old tax surveys that suggest the glacier wasn't taxed surprise, and therefore might have been left alone on purpose, floating like an icy free agent between administrative zones. And then there are the romantics, those who believe that a particularly poetic cartographer simply couldn't resist including the majestic glacier on his border maps. A fringe theory, of course, but we like fringe theories here, especially the sleepy ones. One particularly obscure historian, Dr. Jürgen Lenz of Innsbruck, wrote a delightful and barely cited monograph titled Frozen Sovereignty, Alpine Glaciers and Imperial Cartography, 1852, 1905. In it, he argues that the glacier in question was marked not once but 3 times in official border surveys, and that each time the marking was slightly different, as if no one could agree on which side of the icy beast belonged to whom, but no one corrected it either. That's the true magic of imperial record-keeping. Once something gets written down, it becomes reality. Whether anyone likes it or not, the ink freezes, so to speak. So for decades, this glacier was owned, silently, proudly, accidentally, and like most bureaucratic oddities, it remained buried in paperwork until the empire dissolved in 1918, leaving its chilly asset as a sort of legacy possession unclaimed, unnoticed, and probably not included in the inheritance paperwork that followed. Somewhere around this point in our wanderings, your thoughts might start to slow. Your breathing follows the rhythm of the glacier bell, steady, ponderous, ancient. The idea that something as impermanent as a government can claim something as timeless as ice feels faintly absurd. And yet, that's the kind of thing empires did all the time. In fact, there's a mainstream historical precedent. the Berlin Conference of 1884–85, where European powers divvied up Africa like a buffet. Lyon also saw territories mapped and claimed that no European had ever stepped foot in. Entire regions were signed over based on faulty maps or hearsay. Why wouldn't the glacier get scooped up the same way? But the quirky fact, the one I want you to hold on to as your eyes begin to grow heavier, is this. In 1893, a postal inspector, stationed in a small Austrian town near the glacier, reported that no reliable delivery route could be established to the ice, as if someone had asked him to deliver mail to a glacier. He filed the report. No one followed up. He got a promotion. The glacier remained unmet. It's these sleepy miscommunications that build history teeny oddities that, in their own way, outlast empires. So let's take one last look at that frostbitten map, its lines fading slightly under the weight of time. Somewhere up here, drawn in ink that's gone a little smudgy, an empire claimed something that never belonged to anyone. Or maybe it did, or maybe it still does. And maybe, just maybe, you're the only one right now floating above it, quietly aware of this forgotten imperial ice cube. Paper maps and cold mistakes, you drift lower now, letting your feet skim the crisp air just above the frosted edges of a century-old map, its corners curling like ancient leaves, its ink flaking off in quiet protest against time. You hover over what should be familiar territory, a stretch of the Alps known today for serene hiking trails, chocolate that tastes like velvet, and souvenir shops that sell cowbells no one needs. But the version of this region in your hands is different. It's not so much a map as a piece of imperial ambition disguised as lines and labels. And it's here, somewhere between the ornate cursive of Tyrol and the severe squiggle of Graubünden, that you spot it. The glacier, not labeled, not celebrated, just there and bothered and unboarded like a guest no one remembers inviting. The paper beneath your fingertips feels brittle, the kind that would crackle if you folded it even a little too eagerly. And tucked into the corner, in a handwriting that screams "I haven't had lunch yet," is a signature from some mid-level Habsburg official with a name too long for any modern spreadsheet. This, as it turns out, is where the cold mistake begins. In the late 19th century, empires didn't just expand by war. No, they expanded by surveying. If you could measure it, you could own it. Land became numbers. Forests were turned into harvest estimates. Rivers were charted not for poetry, but for shipping logistics. And mountains, the mountains were catalogued with a sort of detached awe, as if their peaks were merely inconvenient bumps in the supply chain. That's where the glacial confusion creeps in. You see, while surveying teams trudged through the Alps, attempting to mark boundaries between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and neighboring regions, they were working with tools that today would struggle to get. Wi-Fi, compasses, barometers, and the occasional theodolite were their best friends. And of course, let's not forget, they were also working with glaciers that moved, very slowly, yes, but moved nonetheless. One might say that land was playing an incredibly polite practical joke. By the time survey results were compiled into official border maps and stamped with imperial seals, the glacier had shifted, not dramatically, not maliciously, but just enough to be somewhere else. And when you're drawing straight lines across mountaintops, even a slight wiggle becomes an international headache. And here's where we meet the mainstream historical fact of this section. The Austro-Hungarian Third Military Survey, conducted between 1869 and 1887, was one of the most ambitious mapping projects of its time. It aimed to cover the entirety of the empire with detailed, standardized maps, and in doing so, it not only documented cities and towns, but also glaciers, though with the same indifference you might give a speed bump on a royal carriage route. The survey's goal was to create uniformity across a mosaic of languages, climates, and currencies. Borders were drawn with a ruler's certainty over landscapes that laughed at such arrogance, and on more than one occasion glaciers were included within the empire's borders simply because, well, someone thought they were supposed to be. But it wasn't always so passive. Some historians argue there may have been deliberate inclusion, that these glaciers, cold and inhospitable though they were, might have symbolized alpine dominance, a kind of frosty crown atop imperial holdings. Yet no evidence exists that emperors sent scouts to camp atop them. No romantic legends of glacial duels or mountaintop treaties. Just clerks, pencils, and chilly mistakes. Which brings us to one of the more delightfully quirky historical facts you'll ever hear. In 1882, a regional administrator in Innsbruck sent a memo to Vienna requesting funding to build a watchtower on a glacier. Not for defense, not even for science, but because, as he stated, the border has begun to move again, and we wish to keep an eye on it. As if the glacier had ambitions of its own, the funding was denied. The glacier was not consulted, and the map remained unchanged. Over the decades, this sort of semi-serious paperwork accumulated like snowfall, light at first, but soon heavy, layered, and very hard to melt. The problem with such borders is that they become institutionalized. Once a line is drawn, bureaucracies build around it. Ministries send inspectors, inspectors file reports. Reports go unread, and in this sleepy shuffle, the empire continued to own a glacier no one really wanted to deal with. You can almost imagine some junior official being told, "Yes, Franz, Go check on our icy possession. No, don't forget your hat. Now, you might ask, why didn't anyone fix it? Why didn't future surveys correct the error, if it even was one? That's where the open scholarly debate comes in. Some believe the glacier's inclusion was, in fact, strategic. It allowed Austria-Hungary to assert visual dominance in maps, claiming high-altitude ground as a symbol of sovereignty, even if it meant claiming frozen, uninhabitable terrain. Others argue the empire was too decentralized to notice. With its dual monarchy and often clashing regional interests, it was entirely possible for an administrative decision to go unnoticed or unchallenged for decades. Add in linguistic confusion, German, Hungarian, Slovenian, Italian, all competing for label space on the same sheet, and you've got yourself a map that no one quite understands, but everyone agrees must be correct. That's the magic of empire. Confusion that's been notarized. Meanwhile, the glacier itself changed. Slowly, silently, it melted and refroze, shifted and stretched. It advanced a little in the 1890s, retreated by the 1910s, and continued its plodding existence entirely indifferent to whether Vienna or Bern considered it owned. It is perhaps the most dignified rejection of bureaucracy in natural history. But then, history has a funny way of forgetting what matters and remembering what doesn't. When the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed after World War I, its territories were carved up by treaties and commissions who likely never saw the land they divided. Maps were redrawn yet again, some based on ethnicity, others on military convenience. But the glacier, it remained oddly untouched in the paperwork. No one fought for it. No one objected to losing it. It simply stayed. On some maps its imperial association lingered. On others, it faded. And in this silence, it became a kind of ghost border, one that haunts historians not with conflict but with paperwork. Even today, there are local alpine guides who tell stories about the Kaiser's ice, as if it still belongs to the long-dead Franz Joseph himself. Of course, that's probably more folklore than legal fact, probably. But if you were to stand on it now carefully, with boots designed to grip ancient ice, you might feel something beneath your feet. Not just cold, but history. A kind of weight that isn't physical but bureaucratic. The kind of weight only centuries of misunderstood paperwork can create. It's the sensation of standing on a mistake that everyone quietly agreed to live with. So as you glide just above the glacier's shimmering blue-white surface, your breath fogging the air in soft loops, imagine for a moment that you are an empire. You've got ambitions, armies, ceremonial mustaches, and a vast filing cabinet of territories. Would you notice the ice under your feet, or would you, like the Habsburgs, simply let it be? Maybe you'd even hope no one asked. After all, who wants to be the one to explain why you accidentally claimed something that melts? Austria-Hungary's snowy Saprizio are wandering now, slightly lower through the mist, brushing the cool eddies of air that spiral off the glacier's surface like ghosts exhaling. The sky above is pale and empty, a faint ivory smudge that it seems to shimmer between sleep and morning. You aren't quite awake, but you're alert in that dreamlike way that lets you notice oddities. And that's perfect, because here, nestled in the chill and completely unfazed by the passage of time, is one of the strangest chapters in Austria-Hungary's imperial history, the moment it realized it had inherited, not conquered, not negotiated for, but passively inherited a giant, glittering glacier. The empire, if we're being honest, was not particularly nimble. By the late 19th century, it was an old machine with beautiful gears that turned slowly, some of which had rusted entirely. Austria-Hungary was a dual monarchy, a symphonic marriage of Austria and Hungary under one emperor, which meant everything from railways to census records came with double the signatures and none of the urgency. Still, it had an appetite for expansion, particularly the tidy, administrative kind where you could extend borders on paper without sending anyone into the field with snowshoes. That's exactly how the empire ended up with this surprise in the Alps. The surprise didn't come with trumpets or fireworks. There was no official celebration, no icy ribbon-cutting ceremony. Instead, it arrived like most bureaucratic surprises, due through the mail, according to a series of dusty letters preserved in the Austrian National Archives, sometime in the 1890s. A regional governor from Tyrol wrote to the Ministry of the Interior. He wasn't making demands or reporting a disaster. No, he simply wanted to confirm whether the empire intended to maintain a jurisdictional claim on the Hochjoch-Ferner Glacier, given that, in his words, no buildings, permanent settlements, nor taxable activities exist upon it. Translation: do we still want this useless block of ice? The ministry's reply, according to a fragment found decades later, was as ambiguous as a weather forecast in Latin. It acknowledged the existence of the glacier, confirmed that it fell within imperial territory as last measured, and concluded almost poetically that the matter does not presently require amendment. And that was it. That's how an empire shrugged its way into owning a glacier. Of course, that shrug had legal weight. By acknowledging the glacier's inclusion within the empire's existing boundaries and deciding not to update or adjust them, Austria-Hungary essentially admitted, in writing, yes, that's ours. Not passionately, not excitedly, but with the same resigned energy you might use when realizing that umbrella in your closet isn't yours and deciding to just keep it anyway. But there's a mainstream historical layer here that gives this whole episode its peculiar credibility. During the 1870s and 1880s, as the empire conducted widespread topographic and cadastral surveys, those are the kinds of maps used to define land ownership and taxation. There was significant attention given to high-altitude territories. Why? Because the railway boom meant new alpine passes were suddenly economically relevant, not for settlement, mind you, but for controlling trade and transportation routes. In particular, the Brenner Pass region, which lies not far from our glacial friend, was a strategic artery connecting the north and south of the empire. This meant that controlling adjacent ridgelines, even the frosty, uninhabitable ones, gave the empire a logistical edge, or at least the illusion of one. So, the inclusion of the glacier may not have been a total accident. It may have been a calculated act of cartographic conservatism. Better to include the ice and not need it, than to exclude it and regret it. After all, no one wants to be the empire that forgot to claim its own Alps. But here's the quirky historical twist. In 1903, a traveling geologist named Wilhelm Moll wrote a brief, quietly eccentric article in the Alpine Kundliche Blätter, a niche publication for alpine studies, in which he describes a wooden post, partly buried in ice, that bore a faded imperial insignia. And a year 1889, Moll theorized it was an old surveying marker, possibly hammered in during one of the early military surveys. But the strange thing is, no one ever admitted to placing it there. It wasn't on official maps. It wasn't noted in local government reports. It was just there, like a forgotten souvenir from a trip no one remembered taking. This has sparked ongoing debate among historians. Was the empire actively surveying and marking the glacier's edges for future reference, or was this just a bored surveyor getting carried away with his mallet? It's a debate that never quite gets resolved, because, well, no one wants to climb a glacier just to argue about it. But this brings us to something more slippery than ice: scholarly uncertainty. See, some argue that glaciers by their nature resist ownership. You can claim the land beneath them, sure, but the glacier itself, it moves, it melts, it might not even be in the same place next year. So how do you legislate a moving target? Legal scholars in the 20th century, reviewing pre-WWI land treaties, quietly admitted that high-altitude boundaries were often fuzzy, both literally and figuratively. A boundary might be drawn on a ridgeline that, due to glacial movement, has since shifted several meters or even kilometers, and if no one complains, the error persists. Which is exactly what happened here. No one complained. Not the Swiss, not the Italians, not even the Tyrolean farmers whose nearest goat was miles from the glacier's toe. Everyone just let it sit there like an unopened letter from an ex-emperor. But the deeper you go into this frosty oversight, the more endearing it becomes. Because in some ways, it reflects exactly how the empire functioned near its end, with elaborate procedures, ambiguous documentation, and an unshakable belief that things would probably work themselves out. As you walk now along the glacier's pale curve, hearing the distant creak of ice shifting ever so slightly beneath you, you can almost imagine the empire's officials poring over maps in a warm Viennese office. They sip coffee, they stamp papers, they glance at the glacier on the map, exchange shrugs, and go back to discussing train schedules and postage rates. Meanwhile, the glacier sits. It doesn't care. It never did. But it is, technically, part of the empire. Not through conquest, not through discovery, but through the simple, wondrous, absurd machinery of administration. And isn't that the most quietly thrilling kind of ownership? How to inherit ice. You descend now into a valley painted in silence, the air so still that even your breath seems hesitant to disturb it. Below you, the glacier stretches like a frozen sea, not angry or dramatic but peacefully calm, ancient scythe and storm. There's a dull blue shimmer where light touches its edges, and the cracks running through it are quiet things, like veins in marble. It's not a place you'd expect to be fought over. And yet, somehow, it ended up in the possession of one of Europe's most tangled political entities. Not by conquest, ambition, or ideology, but through a form of inheritance that feels more like a bureaucratic dare. This was not the type of inheritance where golden rings and dusty paintings are passed down with formal signatures and solemn handshakes. No, this was the sort that comes from indecision layered over generations. Governments simply forget to say, "We don't want that," and thus accidentally keep it. You see, when empires dissolve, they tend to do it loudly. Treaties are drafted, maps are redrawn, and angry people with pens and typewriters work overtime. But what happens to the leftovers? Not the territories everyone remembers, but the pieces. So remote, so awkwardly positioned, that they're barely noticed. That's where things like Glacier slip through the cracks of civilization. After World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was dissolved like sugar into messy, uneven, and mostly irreversible. The Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye in 1919 was the formal nail in its frozen coffin, assigning chunks of the former empire to new or expanded nations, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Italy, among others. Everyone was busy arguing about railway stations, rivers, and industrial cities. No one sat down and said, "Ah yes, and the glacier, who gets the glacier?" That's how it lingered, like an ice cube in a glass no one's drinking from. The mainstream fact here is simple. In post-imperial realignments, small geographical features are often left out of treaties if they are considered non-strategic, and glaciers for most of the 20th century were considered just that, non-strategic. No one thought of them as national treasures or environmental assets. They were hazards to navigation, irrelevant to trade, and impossible to live on. You couldn't build a factory on one. You couldn't even pave a road across it without engineering headaches. No one fought for them. And yet, here was this glacier, still technically inside what had been Austro-Hungarian borders, its inclusion supported by decades of cartographic evidence and old legal documents. Austria, which emerged as the first successor state and held on to many of the empire's German-speaking territories, inherited far more than it likely wanted. Inheriting frozen wilderness was not exactly an honor, but Austria ended up with the task anyway, and because the border redrawings focused on populated valleys and transit routes, the glacier sitting far above anything resembling a road was left unmentioned. That's the bureaucratic equivalent of someone walking away from a card game and accidentally taking the tablecloth home. And here's where things get even sleepier, more deliciously absurd. In the 1930s, as the memory of the empire faded and Europe turned its attention toward more ominous matters, a surveyor in the Tyrolean region reportedly submitted a revised map for postal use. On that map, the glacier still appeared within Austrian jurisdiction. Not because it had been reasserted, not because of national pride, simply because the old map he referenced still showed it that way. It was a photocopy of a decision no one had ever really made. Now, onto the quirky fact. In 1947, a Swiss mountaineering journal published a tongue-in-cheek article titled "Lost and Found: The Glacier No One Wants." The author, known only by initials possibly to avoid embarrassment, claimed that, if no nation formally claimed the glacier, he would plant a flag and declare it a sovereign mountaineering republic. He even suggested its motto, "We slip, therefore we are." The article was, of course, satire, but it triggered actual letters to local alpine clubs, asking whether this claim could be recognized. The answer was a polite no, but one that, interestingly, didn't clarify ownership either. Everyone seemed to agree that yes, the glacier was there, and yes, someone probably owned it, but also, no one really cared enough to check. By the 1950s, the glacier was quietly folded into Austria's topographical records, like an old coat, in a wardrobe no one wears but refuses to throw away. And that's where the open scholarly debate simmers. Does a state truly own a feature like a glacier? If its legal documents don't explicitly say so, some legal scholars argue that continuous administrative practice such as including it on maps, recognizing it in land registries, and not contesting its presence constitutes passive possession. Others push back, claiming that without formal legal confirmation, especially in post-imperial contexts, no ownership can be assumed. They point out that multiple countries now claim parts of the same glacier due to shifting borders and imprecise original documents, and glaciers, as it happens, are mobile enough to invite this chaos. They move slowly, almost imperceptibly, but over the course of decades, their front lines shift, crossing boundaries that bureaucrats once thought permanent. What does it mean when something owned in 1900 is now physically located elsewhere? Do you own where it is now, or where it was? Or do you give up and call it shared? This debate has even made its way into modern climate law. As glaciers recede, they reveal ground that was previously buried, sometimes for centuries. That land may contain historical borders, ancient artifacts, or ambiguous territory lines, and nations are, once again, trying to decide whose ice was it, and whose dirt is it now. Meanwhile, back in the archives, old Austrian records continue to list the glacier without fanfare, without commentary, just as a thing that exists, like a lonely footnote. It's assigned a cadastral number. It's categorized under frozen terrain. And, most beautifully of all, it's marked non-taxable, as though someone considered billing it for occupying space. And it never once melted in protest. As you drift along the edge of the glacier now, you can hear the occasional snap beneath the surface. It's not dangerous, just the sound of ancient air pockets sighing under your weightless presence. You glide past a rocky outcrop where lichen has grown in yellow-green splotches, and further along, you spot what might be the remains of a survey marker, a metal post. Bent and rusted, its original paint now indistinguishable from ice and time. There's something quietly poetic in all this. A glacier, claimed not through warfare, but through inattentiveness. Passed down not through ceremony, but through assumption. Maintained not by will, but by inertia. And yet, despite the lack of intention, it remains part of the historical fabric of a nation that probably never set out to possess it. That's how to inherit ice. You don't chase it. You don't ask for it. You just forget to let go. When no one wants a glacier, you float now above a border that was never meant to be argued over. No fences here, no warning signs or checkpoints. just a soft, undulating whiteness broken by the occasional rocky spine poking through, like the vertebrae of some ancient beasts buried beneath the snow. This is the kind of place where time slows. Not just the ticking clock kind of slow, but the deep, glacial slow, the kind where empires can rise and fall before the ice decides to melt even a meter. And it is here, in this serene, icy limbo, that we find the rarest sort of territory, land so uninviting, so logistically inconvenient, that no one truly wants it, or rather no one wants to deal with the hassle of claiming it, because claiming a glacier, as it turns out, isn't just about sovereignty, it's about paperwork, and maps and international relations and boots, and absolutely no one enjoys combining all five in a snowstorm. By the time the Austro-Hungarian Empire was shuffled off the geopolitical stage after World War I, there was already confusion about the glacier. When the Treaty of Saint-Germain was signed in 1919, dividing the empire's remains like the last slices of stale cake at a diplomatic dinner, glaciers were not at the top of the list. Italy got South Tyrol, which included numerous alpine valleys, but what about the elevation zones above those valleys? And more specifically, what about the glaciers sitting on those elevations? A mainstream fact, the Treaty of Saint, like many treaties of its kind, delineated borders using topographical markers that were often vague, especially at high altitudes. Phrases like along the crest of the Alps or following the watershed were commonly used. Sounds practical, but here's the issue: glaciers don't care about watersheds. They slide, they deform, they ignore crest lines, they're geological toddlers. The result? Some territories were effectively left unclaimed, not because nations didn't care, but because it was easier to let the uncertainty sit there than to march surveyors back up a frozen slope to update things. And in the decades that followed, that uncertainty hardened like permafrost. Italy made certain claims, but none definitive. Austria inherited topographical records but rarely enforced them. Switzerland, too, looked at its alpine neighbors with a sort of neutral shrug. Nobody really wanted to say, yes, that frozen slab belongs to us, because doing so meant accepting all the awkward questions that came with it, like who maintains it, who insures it, who is liable if it causes an avalanche across a border. This is where the situation turns comical. In 1964, during a minor land registry update in South Tyrol, a local Italian official noted in a dry memo that Glacier, the zones of undetermined status, shall not be revised at this time. That's governance speak for, let's pretend it's not there. The glacier had effectively become the cold version of that squeaky floorboard you never step on, just easier to avoid. But while national governments were busy ignoring it, local alpine communities weren't completely unaware. There are stories, some whispered, some written in alpine journals, about skiers and mountaineers being told that certain parts of the glacier were technically Austrian, even while standing on Italian soil. Guides would chuckle and say you're skiing in two countries at once, and then move on without further explanation. Which brings us to a quirky little side note. A popular cross-border ski tour in the Edstal Alps includes a rest stop that sits squarely atop the glacier in question. In the 1970s, a group of enthusiastic Swiss skiers hoisted a makeshift flag there, a hybrid design featuring both Austrian and Italian colors, with a snowflake in the middle. No one stopped them. The photo made it into the local newspaper. A few months later, the flag disappeared, likely buried in a snowdrift. The glacier didn't object, but it did inch a little west that year. And here we touch the icy surface of an open scholarly debate. What is the legal status of unadministered natural features in Europe's post-imperial landscapes? There's been a gentle academic tug-of-war over whether glaciers, especially ones caught in border confusion, require explicit relegalization in modern treaties, or if their status simply continues by default. Some scholars argue that silence is not consent, and that without modern agreements, these glaciers exist in a kind of legal fog. Others argue the opposite, that continued passive inclusion in national mapping, alpine safety patrols, and tourist regulations effectively constitutes ownership, even if no one stamped the ice. There's even a delightfully obscure paper from the University of Graz titled Frozen Claims, The Legal Philosophy of Glacial Territory, which argues that glaciers are the final frontier of 19th century boundary absurdity. The paper posits that their movement challenges the static concept of national borders, and that they should be considered transient zones rather than fixed land. It's a lovely thought. Unfortunately, it's also completely impractical when a border dispute arises. And believe it or not, one very nearly did. In 1983, an Italian mountaineering club proposed installing a weather station on the glacier's upper ridge. Austria responded with a polite but firm request to delay construction until a formal review could be completed. No one could say exactly where the ridge fell according to the original imperial records. No one could locate a single page in the Saint-Germain appendices that mentioned it. And no one wanted to admit they'd been ignoring it for half a century. So the project was shelved. The weather remained undated. The ice remained unclaimed. It's one of those moments in history where the absence of action becomes the most telling fact of all. As you float back above it now, the glacier gleams faintly in the moonlight, utterly indifferent to these debates. It has no idea that multiple countries have quietly passed on the chance to claim it like a cursed artifact in a fairy tale. Number. Empire. No republic, no committee has managed to muster enough enthusiasm to deal with the logistics of icy ownership, because in the end, the glacier isn't fertile, it isn't accessible, and it definitely isn't profitable. It's just there, and when something just exists, with no political or economic urgency to stir human action, the default setting is always the same: ignore it until someone else asks about it, and as of now, no one's really asking. That's the magic of glacial diplomacy, the kind where every stakeholder politely turns the other cheek and hopes the ice keeps sliding the other way. But if you listen closely, right now, as your body softens into the chill and your thoughts drift into snow-crusted quiet, you can hear the creak of ancient pressure beneath you, not loud, just steady, as if the glacier is waiting for someone to finally notice, not with flags, but with questions. Because even if no one wants to own it, someone, someday, will need to explain it. And that, dear traveler, is how glaciers earn their patience. Cartographers versus the ice. There is a particular flavor of frustration only known to a specific kind of persona. 19th century cartographer perched on a rocky slope with numb fingers, a theodolite that refuses to stay level, and a map flapping in the wind like a rebellious bedsheet. You float now just behind one such figure, an imperial surveyor named Otto Hafner, who has been assigned the delicate and deeply thankless task of mapping the high-altitude regions of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The year is 1885. Otto has been up here for hours. His assistant has wandered off to chase a mule that bolted down the slope after getting spooked by a falling icicle. The sun is too bright, the air is too thin, and the glacier directly in front of him simply won't stop moving. Ever so slightly, ever so rudely, the icy surface shifts under the weight of its own ancient momentum, and Otto, who is already 3 weeks behind schedule, has to pretend he can measure that. This was not an uncommon problem during the great wave of imperial surveying projects across Europe in the 19th century. As empires expanded and consolidated, so too did their need to quantify and label every inch of their holdings. Cartographers were dispatched like icy missionaries to draw lines, measure peaks, and identify who owned what. But glaciers posed a particular problem because no matter how precise your instruments, it's difficult to draw a fixed line across something that's technically oozing. This leads us to one of the more overlooked mainstream historical facts. Glaciers were often the bane of 19th century cartographers. While rivers could be followed and mountains could be triangulated, glaciers were changeable. Crevasses opened overnight. Margins fluctuated seasonally. Even color posed a problem. Was that blue-gray edge the glacier, or was it just snowpack? Consequently, many maps from this era deliberately omitted precise glacial boundaries, or else filled them in with vague, cloud-like shading and the occasional Latin annotation that loosely translated to "here be cold nonsense." But that didn't stop the empire from trying. The Third Military Survey, Austria-Hungary's massive cartographic endeavor spanning from 1869 to 1887, required that all topographical features be documented with precision. Entire divisions were formed to tackle alpine terrain. And that's where Otto comes in, because somewhere deep in the survey archives is his name, scrawled in the margins of a boundary sketch that seems to show the glacier's tongue cutting across 3 different jurisdictions. It's a chaotic line, like a child drew it while sneezing. And yet, this line drawn under duress, possibly while Otto was hypothermic, became official. This brings us to the delightful contradiction of imperial administration. The empire demanded precision, but also demanded that no one question the results. Once a glacier was drawn on a map, regardless of how ridiculous the line looked or how inaccurate it was, 6 months later, it became gospel. The map was printed, the borders were referenced, and no one, not even the cartographer, had the energy to go back up and fix it, which leads to our favorite kind of historical detritus: quiet absurdities locked in ink. In one case, documented in a 1907 footnote buried in the Viennese Geological Society's newsletter, a field team was sent to confirm a glacial boundary between Tyrol and the South Tyrolean region. After a 3-day trek, they arrived to find the glacier had shifted, rendering the marker they were sent to locate now buried several meters beneath new ice. Instead of updating the map, they returned to Vienna and marked the old location with a footnote that simply read, "Approximate, subject to seasonal whim." That phrase, "subject to seasonal whim," became something of a running joke among later cartographers. And here's the quirky historical fact for tonight. In 1911, a Viennese satirical magazine called Der Schneesturm, the Snowstorm, published a fictional account of a cartographer who attempted to claim a glacier for himself, on the grounds that it had moved entirely into the blank space between 2 borders. He declared it the Free Republic of Chile, appointed his donkey as foreign minister, and demanded recognition from the emperor. Surprisingly, the emperor never responded. The humor hit a little too close to home for some, though, because In real bureaucratic circles, there was legitimate confusion over how to classify these unmapped glacial zones. Some officials wanted them listed as dynamic territories, others wanted to assign them temporary jurisdiction based on seasonal surveys, and others just wanted the whole issue frozen indefinitely, figuratively and literally. That's where we get to the scholarly debate that quietly haunts border specialists even now. Can a map be legally binding if its content is known to be inaccurate the moment it's printed? Some argue yes, citing the doctrine of fixed intent, that the intent behind the border matters more than the physical feature it's tied to. Others, particularly those dealing with alpine and Himalayan borders, point out that such intentions become useless when natural features move faster than bureaucracies. It's a philosophical ice rink, and no one's wearing skates. But what did all this mean for the glacier we've been tracing? Well, by the turn of the 20th century, it had been inked onto at least 4 different editions of official imperial maps, each time slightly differently. One version, used primarily by the military, showed the glacier as straddling 2 provinces. Another, used for postal routes, placed it entirely in Tyrol. A third map, used for ecclesiastical records, hilariously omitted it altogether, as if the church simply didn't acknowledge frozen terrain. And the fourth, a rare version used by alpine rescue units, labeled the glacier simply as Hazard Zone B. This chaotic inconsistency would have led to legal disputes in most cases. But again, no one cared enough to challenge it, which meant that when the empire dissolved, all 4 maps were inherited by successor states, each with its own interpretation of who now owned the glacier. And since no one wanted to send a new Otto back up the mountain to redraw it, the ambiguity was passed down like a very cold, very useless family heirloom. You hover now over a new scene, a stack of dusty filing cabinets in a municipal archive in Innsbruck, untouched since the 1960s. Inside, under miscellaneous topography, rests a folder labeled Hockelpine Grenzverhältnis High Alpine Border Conditions. Inside that folder, 4 faded maps, a few handwritten memos from the 1930s, and one particularly amusing letter from a provincial official in 1958 that reads, "Regarding the glacier, we are inclined to leave matters as they lie, lest we disturb." An arrangement that has, through neglect, achieved its own harmony. That's what passes for alpine diplomacy, letting sleeping maps lie. And it's in that spirit that the glacier continues to exist. Quietly, legally foggy and cartographically surreal. No tourists know this, no hikers notice it, but somewhere, underfoot, they are walking on a centuries-old accident, not just of geography, but of imperial stubbornness, cartographic exasperation, and the ultimate human instinct to look at a problem, sigh, and say, well, it's probably fine. So as you watch Otto Hafner finally pack up his instruments, muttering something unprintable about glaciers and bureaucracy, you realize something gentle but powerful. History isn't always made by wars and kings. Sometimes it's made by tired men with pencils, freezing their toes off on a slope, just trying to draw a line that won't move beneath them. And sometimes, that line becomes the coldest legacy of all. The border that slides at night. The air is thinner here, more silence than oxygen as you drift just above the ridgeline that should, in theory, mark the boundary between nations. This is where maps pretend certainty exists, a line etched into paper, a firm declaration of where one place ends and another begins. But tonight, in the stillness of the Alps, where even your thoughts seem to echo, you realize something odd. That line, it moves, not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, imperceptibly, like a sigh stretched over decades. And beneath that sigh is the glacier, rolling forward in secret like a diplomat with no paperwork and an excellent poker face. You're not imagining things. This glacier, the one Austria-Hungary once claimed almost by accident, doesn't stay where it's told. While cities can expand and rivers can flood, a glacier's migration is far more mysterious. It's not a reaction to politics or planning. It's the slow rebellion of physics. And here lies our strange truth for the night. There exists to this day an alpine border that physically slides at night. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, actually slides. Let's begin with a mainstream fact. Glaciers are rivers of ice, not static blocks. They move due to gravity, temperature, internal pressure, and meltwater beneath their base, depending on slope, thickness, and conditions. A glacier might slide several centimeters or even meters a day. This motion is called glacial flow, and it doesn't care about survey markers, treaties, or human concepts of property. What you own today might physically shift elsewhere tomorrow. That's not just poetic, it's legally maddening. In the case of our beloved glacial anomaly, the one wedged between Austria and Italy, and possibly Switzerland depending on which coffee-stained map you use, this movement has created decades of low-level bureaucratic confusion. The toe, its lower end, has at times stretched across what is technically sovereign territory belonging to multiple states. On certain days, its footprint covers Austria, other days, Italy, occasionally both. There was even a brief 1994 moment where, according to one satellite measurement, it technically crossed into Swiss airspace, just for an afternoon. Switzerland declined to comment, but perhaps the most quietly hilarious episode occurred in 2005. when the European Union commissioned a project to use satellite imaging to better define alpine boundaries for conservation purposes. This involved cross-referencing modern topography with historical borders. In most cases it was straightforward, but when analysts reached this particular glacial zone, they encountered something odd. The glacier had not only moved, it had flattened out and expanded slightly, nudging the administrative boundary about 40 meters into what had previously been Italian territory. Not dramatically, just enough to raise questions. No one panicked, but someone did send an email. A rather cautious message from Brussels to the Alpine Border Commission. Yes, that's a real thing. Asked whether this constituted a change in national jurisdiction due to natural movement. The Alpine Border Commission, a body whose entire existence revolves around never answering anything directly, replied with a masterpiece of avoidance. The glacier, they wrote, exists within a cooperative zone of joint stewardship, and therefore does not presently necessitate redefinition of legal boundaries. Translation: please don't make us fix this. That glacier, you see, had become a hot potato of frozen geography, too small to trigger a dispute, too complicated to ignore. And it's been like this for over a century. Back in 1921, not long after the Austro-Hungarian Empire became a collection of exhausted republics and annexed provinces, there was a proposal to conduct a new high-altitude survey of the Alps. One of its goals was to update borders to reflect natural changes caused by erosion, landslides, and yes, glacial motion. It made it as far as a single meeting in Milan before being tabled indefinitely due to lack of consensus on methodology. Or, more honestly, no one could agree whether they should follow the old maps, the new ridgelines, or the current state of the ice. That was the last time anyone officially tried. Instead, something fascinating happened. A gentleman's agreement emerged, an unwritten rule that no nation would officially contest or update the glacial boundary. Instead, each would quietly monitor it from their side, occasionally sending up researchers, checking melt rates, and exchanging data without ever acknowledging that no one really knows who owns the ice. This is where we introduce tonight's quirky fact. In 1982, a group of Austrian scientists installed a monitoring pole in the center of the glacier to measure ice movement. They gave it a name, France, and painted it red and white, the national colors. 3 weeks later, Italian researchers installed a second pole just a few meters away. They named theirs Giuseppe, painted it green and white, and included a small brass plaque. The two poles have been quietly sliding alongside each other for decades, sometimes drifting apart, sometimes getting closer, like a very slow romantic subplot. As of the most recent photos, Franz and Giuseppe are about 17 meters apart and still moving. Occasionally, tourists mistake them for high-altitude art installations, but beyond the cuteness of painted poles, there is a deeper, unresolved legal issue here. In international law, borders are typically fixed not just geographically, but conceptually. They are treated as immovable, even when drawn over very movable things. But glaciers challenge that idea. If a border is defined by the crest of a glacier, what happens when that glacier migrates? Is the border supposed to move with it? Or does the original line remain frozen in metaphor, even as the landscape ignores it? Legal scholars have wrestled with this. Some propose that the original survey coordinates take precedence, meaning the border is fixed at whatever GPS point it was first defined, regardless of the glacier's position. Others argue for natural boundaries, a concept dating back to Roman law, which suggests that borders should follow the features they describe. In that case, the border should move with the glacier. In the Alps, this debate remains unresolved. In most cases, countries simply agree to disagree, which sounds like a schoolyard solution, but is surprisingly effective when no one wants to start an argument over snow. You glide now above Franz and Giuseppe, the glacier rolling beneath them, like a very slow conveyor belt. The sky is deepening into cobalt, and the stars are beginning to blink into existence one by one. It's easy to forget, in this moment of stillness, that this is technically a contested zone. No fences, no guards, just ancient ice and paint slowly drifting across sovereign lines. It's a kind of peace that can only happen when everyone is too polite or too tired to argue. But even this sleepy glacier has made its mark on paperwork. In a footnote to an EU environmental report in 2009, there's a reference to transitional glacial zones of undetermined stewardship, and tucked next to that is a parenthetical list. This glacier, our glacier, is the first item. It is legally nameless, politically ambiguous, beautifully ignored, and still sliding. Tonight, as you settle gently onto its surface, you can feel it beneath you, not rumbling, not cracking, but moving just a little, just enough. And you, traveler of frozen time, are now part of that movement. Unnoticed, unclaimed, drifting peacefully across borders, drawn by men who never imagined ice could argue back. When glaciers outlive empires, it's sometime after midnight now. The glacier glows faintly under the pale wash of stars, and the world feels utterly timeless. You drift gently above it, the wind barely stirring, as if the air itself is trying not to disturb the long memory frozen beneath. And make no mistake, this glacier remembers. It has watched emperors rise with grand declarations, fade into footnotes, and vanish altogether. It has outlasted treaties that reshaped continents. It has survived ideologies and invasions, flags and revolutions. While men have drawn maps and torn them apart, this ice has simply kept moving slow, patient, eternal. So tonight, we pause not for the empire or the nations it fractured into, but for the glacier itself. Because in the strangest twist of all, this forgotten mass of ice has become one of the most enduring legacies of a political structure that no longer exists. Let's begin with a mainstream historical truth that, when viewed from a high enough altitude, feels absurd. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, which collapsed in 1918, left behind not just palaces, debt, and literary salons, but also legal boundaries that continued to shape land ownership, postal routes, and border patrol zones more than a century later. In some cases, these borders have been redrawn or refined, but in others, particularly in high altitude, zones like the one we've been circling, the original imperial demarcations, remain effectively untouched. That means the glacier, which no one visits except for climbers and climate researchers, is still governed by the shadow of an empire that hasn't existed since the first season of silent film. That brings us to one of the more bizarre consequences of long-term border inertia. When nations don't actively update frontier zones, they often default to the last comprehensive survey. And in the case of much of the Eastern Alps, that last survey is still the Austro-Hungarian Third Military Mapping Project from the late 1800s. In other words, Austria, Italy, and to some degree Switzerland are still quietly referencing old imperial documents when they calculate high-altitude zoning, even though the empire that produced them collapsed over 100 years ago. That's like planning your road trip using your great-grandfather's horse map, and yet it persists. The reason is partly practical. Conducting new high-altitude surveys is difficult, expensive, and often pointless. The land doesn't host towns or industry. Updating it would require coordinated international teams, precise laser altimetry, and months of field work for a territory that has fewer permanent residents than the inside of a snow globe. So the old borders remain by default. But there's another reason too, an emotional one. The borders drawn by the Austro-Hungarian Empire may have been flawed, but they were consistent. They were the result of meticulous engineering, months of field labor, and a type of topographical rigor that modern bureaucracies, ironically, rarely attempt. It's not that the glacier is loyal to the empire. It's that the empire, for all its flaws, tried to understand the glacier. It measured it, it labeled it, it perhaps accidentally respected it by including it. Now, here's the quirky. In fact, in 2013, a small museum in Innsbruck hosted an exhibit called Empires of Ice, which featured maps, photographs, and artifacts from the Imperial Alpine surveys. Tucked in the corner of one display case was a preserved leather-bound field notebook from 1888. Inside was a sketch of the glacier, hand-drawn by a cartographer who described it as an unremarkable body of ice, slow and stubborn, unlikely to trouble man or God. That anonymous note ended up being wildly incorrect, because today, this glacier is at the center of multiple modern debates about climate change, border law, and cultural memory, and that's where our scholarly discussion begins. In recent years, glacier retreat has revealed not only previously buried land, but also lost artifacts, sold survey markers, forgotten climbing gear, even human remains. In some cases, these discoveries are reshaping how borders are interpreted. One example occurred in 2016 when the melting of the Forni Glacier further west uncovered a stone boundary marker thought to have been lost since 1906. Its appearance triggered a small flurry of academic interest, because it sat meters away from where modern maps had redrawn the line. This prompted a strange but real question. Does the reappearance of a historical marker supersede later cartographic assumptions? The answer is maybe or maybe not. It depends on the treaty, or the weather, or the mood of the regional land office. And this uncertainty, while legally irritating, is historically fascinating, because glaciers by nature are time capsules. They preserve the decisions and indecisions of generations, and in this case, they've become the unlikely stewards. What of a vanished political system? You see, in 1892, an Austro-Hungarian official wrote a dry memorandum on boundary maintenance in which he noted, snowbound limits must be respected in winter and revised in summer, lest we make the mistake of assuming nature cares about our claims. That line, dusty and bureaucratic, now reads like prophecy. Nature does not care, but the empire did. Enough to map it, enough to claim it, and then, as history moved on, enough to forget it. That's the real story tonight, not of a glacier claimed or conquered, but of a glacier left behind, like a diplomatic orphan or a bureaucratic snowman that no one ever came back to melt. Yet even in its neglect it remained valuable, not for its water, not for its land, but for the questions it raised. Because when modern nations look at that glacier, they aren't just seeing ice, they're seeing history they didn't write, boundaries they didn't draw, a legacy that technically isn't theirs, but still affects them every day. It's a shared inheritance with no instructions. And that brings us to a peculiar little twist. In 2020, climate researchers from the EU's Alpine Climate Observatory published a report listing the 10 most politically ambiguous glaciers in Europe. Number 2 on the list, right behind a frozen river in the Caucasus, was this very glacier. The report noted that it lacks formal treaty ownership, yet functions within overlapping zones of passive jurisdiction and historical assumption. That's a very fancy way of saying everyone kind of agrees it's someone else's problem, and yet the glacier still gets monitored, it still gets studied, tourists still ski its slopes, mountain guides still offer routes that weave across invisible borders, and occasionally a hiker will pause and wonder why, when they step in one spot, their phone thinks they're in Italy, but 2 steps later it pings an Austrian signal. That's the empire's echo, rippling through GPS confusion. Tonight, as you rest above it all, cocooned in air so cold it sings, you realize something gentle. There is peace here, not because everyone agreed, but because no one argued loudly enough to ruin it. The glacier, once claimed in the margins of imperial documents, has become a symbol of quiet endurance. Not power, not purpose, just presence. It is not disputed, because it is not desired. And yet, it has outlived every system that ever tried to define it. That, in its own way, is victory. So here we stay for a moment longer above a glacier that no one owns, yet everyone references. The stars wheel slowly overhead. The ice murmurs beneath, like a giant turning in sleep. And all around you is the soft exhale of history continuing, without empire, without borders, without urgency, just stillness, and snow, and the sound of silence sliding gently down a slope. Glacier tours and confused tourists by the time the first faint streaks of sun touch the upper edge of the ice. You're hovering above a winding path marked by tiny red flags, planted like breadcrumbs in the snow. Beneath you, trudging in a slow, careful line, is a group of hikers led by a cheerful man with a blue vest and a walking stick older than most of the tourists behind him. He's the local mountain guide, technically Italian, by birth and residence, but ask him who owns the glacier and he'll wave a hand dismissively and say, "We all do, I suppose. Or maybe none of us." He laughs when he says it, and the tourists laugh with him. But there's a hint of truth there, one more puzzling than the cold air in their lungs or the mystery of where they've just stepped, because what no one tells the tourists is that this route, one of the most popular alpine glacier treks in the Tyrolean region, crosses a border that was never formally agreed upon. The line on the map, if you zoom in closely enough, is either blurred, dashed, or simply missing. That's not an accident, it's a cartographic shrug, the result of decades of indecision wrapped in politeness. And yet, here are the hikers, cheerful and unaware, crossing from Austria into Italy and possibly back again without ever being told. Some of them carry guidebooks that list the glacier as Austrian, while their hotel brochures call it part of Italy's high alpine heritage. One unfortunate man's GPS app registers the hike as taking place entirely within Switzerland, an error caused by a satellite glitch and a poorly calibrated topographic base layer. He'll post about it online later and start a short live debate among travel bloggers. But for now, he just follows a line of red flags like everyone else. This brings us to the mainstream fact. Despite their bureaucratic confusion and frozen remoteness, some glaciers have become popular hiking and skiing destinations, especially as climate change reduces their size and increases access during warmer months. In the Alps, guided glacier tours are offered to amateur climbers, families, and even school groups, complete with safety lectures, harnesses, and hot chocolate. They come for the view, for the experience, and for the photos. Very few come for the geopolitical oddities, and yet, they walk right over them. This glacier in particular, our now familiar patch of frozen border confusion, has hosted thousands of tourists over the years. Some days, as many as 3 or 4 guided groups make the ascent, pausing at the midpoint for a snack break and a few selfies. They are told about the beauty of the ice, the challenge of crevasses, the importance of crampons. What they are not usually told is that they're walking on a piece of land that has, for over a century, existed in a quiet legal limbo that makes for less exciting Instagram captions. And here's where we dip into something a bit more entertaining. A quirky fact that slipped through most travel brochures. In 1997, a German tourist named Dieter M. accidentally became the subject of a border incident, entirely unaware. Dieter, an amateur cartography enthusiast and self-described glacial trivia collector, brought with him an old Austro-Hungarian military map during his solo trek. As a joke, he planted a tiny wooden sign into the snow at what he believed to be the forgotten border, reading simply, "You are now leaving Austria, possibly." He took a picture, smiled, and moved on. Unfortunately, another group of hikers mistook the sign for an official installation. Someone reported it to a local ranger station. A mildly concerned Austrian official filed a report, and for a brief, shining moment, a wooden joke sign became a diplomatic question. No one was arrested. The sign melted into slush by mid, but a copy of the photo still hangs in a cafe in a nearby mountain village, next to a plaque that says, "Dieter almost caused a paperwork avalanche." The cafe sells mugs with the phrase "now." That's the glacier's sense of humor. Quiet, sarcastic, and completely chill. But this odd dance of tourism and territory raises a fascinating scholarly question. Does repeated civilian use of a disputed or undefined territory constitute informal recognition of ownership? International legal scholars refer to this as administrative actualization, the idea that the way land is used can affect who is perceived to control it. So if tourists, local guides, and regional businesses all act as if the glacier is part of one country, does that effectively make it true, even in the absence of formal treaties? Opinions vary. Some argue that such activity is cultural evidence of sovereignty. Others insist that without state-level documentation, it's legally meaningless. A third, more cynical school suggests that this ambiguity is exactly what makes the glacier appealing. It allows everyone to benefit from it without claiming responsibility. That theory has a certain glacial logic. After all, the towns on either side, Austrian on one ridge, Italian on the other, both advertise glacier access. Both include it in tourist pamphlets. Neither has installed a national flag. And when asked who maintains the route markers, both blame the Alpine Club. The Alpine Club, of course, blames the weather. And so, the glacier remains a shared secret, walked on by tourists who come for beauty and leave with boots full of snow, never realizing they've danced across an unresolved legacy of empire. Tonight, as you watch a group pause to photograph the view, you see a child hop playfully across what would, on any other mountain, be a border. He lands in a spray of powder, laughing, unaware that his small leap just crossed the kind of line people once went to war over. And here's the beauty. No one stops him, no sirens, no passports, just snow. It makes you wonder if borders can be so softly crossed here, why not elsewhere? Perhaps glaciers are not just slow rivers of ice, but gentle erasers of conflict. Perhaps what centuries of diplomacy couldn't settle, a few school groups in puffy jackets can. The light fades, and the hikers begin their descent, laughter echoing faintly between ridges. The guide points out some distant peaks and tells a story about marmots stealing socks probably made up, but who's checking? And you, gliding silently above them, realize this. Some of the coldest places on Earth can leave you with the warmest lessons, especially the ones with borders so old, even the mountains have forgotten them. Smugglers, shepherds, and silent slopes. You hover now above a narrow pass just beyond the glacial ridge. The wind curling softly around boulders and snowdrifts like a whisper. The sun is low, casting elongated shadows that stretch across the ice, like ancient scars. And below you, a man in a wool coat moves with careful steps, leading to goats along a well-worn trail. He hums quietly to himself, a song that's either centuries old or made up on the spot. It's hard to tell in this part of the world. The goats are not concerned. They've walked this slope many times. They don't care about the border, but the man does. Because in this part of the Alps, the glacier has long served a strange double purpose as both barrier and gateway. And for centuries, it wasn't soldiers or tourists who navigated these icy slopes. Most often it was the people of the maps. Forgot to mention shepherds, smugglers, wandering monks, fugitives, lovers, people who had reasons to cross a border quietly, and who understood that snow doesn't report you to the authorities. Let's start with a historical truth often left out of school books. Long before the invention of ski resorts and zippered parkas, glaciers were paths. Dangerous, yes, but often more reliable than mountain passes in winter. When snow blocked, valleys and avalanches made roads impassable. Shepherds would use glacial routes to move their animals between seasonal pastures. These transhumance patterns shifting livestock from summer to winter grazing zones date back over 1,000 years in the Alps, and many of those trails passed over what would later become contested or undefined borders. That means some of the earliest people to ignore national lines weren't being defiant, they were just following their sheep. But as the 19th century unfolded and borders hardened, these same trails took on a more complicated role. Enter the smugglers. If you've never imagined smugglers trudging across an icy wasteland with crates of contraband chocolate, now is the time. Because that happened often, especially during the late Austro-Hungarian period and well into the early 20th century. These glacial routes became vital for those moving goods, salt, tobacco, textiles, even cheeses from one tax zone to another. And where the border was unclear, all the better. One Austrian customs report from 1906 refers to the glacier near our old friend Franz and Giuseppe the painted Poles as ein Bereich der reduzierten Präsenz, a zone of reduced presence, which is bureaucratic code for we don't go up there if we can help it. Smugglers took that as an invitation, but even in their clandestine treks they were part of a wider, largely unspoken understanding that the glacier didn't belong to any one country, it belonged to silence. There's a quirky tale that still circulates among older alpine villagers about a man named Emile Roche who, sometime around 1911, supposedly disguised himself as a local priest in order to walk smugglers safely across the glacier. According to legend, he wore a makeshift cassock stitched from canvas and carried a modified censer filled not with incense, but with cloves and tobacco. He never got caught, and by the time World War I arrived, he'd retired to a farmhouse on the Italian side, where he told ghost stories to children and swore the glacier once spoke his name during a blizzard. No one believed him. but no one questioned his navigation skills either. These stories have true, half-frostbitten part of what makes this glacier so strange. It's not just that it's unclaimed or ambiguously owned. It's that, over time, it became known as a kind of neutral ground. Not officially, but spiritually. A place where authorities rarely patrolled, and where traditions moved more freely than governments ever allowed. This leads us into tonight's scholarly question. How do folk borders differ from formal state borders, and what happens when they overlap or conflict? Anthropologists studying alpine regions have long pointed out that, while political borders might say one thing, lived experience often says another. Locals develop their own sense of territory based on language, pasture rights, marriage networks, and yes, safe glacial crossings. In many of these areas, the state's concept of where a country begins or ends was secondary to where your cousin grazed his goats or where the trail to your family's chapel began. That was the real map, the one people used when the snow fell. The thick and the ink of treaties froze in place. In the mid-20th century, researchers from the University of Innsbruck conducted oral history interviews with older villagers in the high Tyrolean valleys. One woman, born in 1899, recalled her mother warning her, "If you see a man with a long coat and no shadow on the glacier, turn back. That's the spirit of someone who never made it down." The interviewers, bless them, tried to determine whether this was folklore or a creative way to discourage girls from meeting smugglers. But she was insistent. The glacier watches, the glacier remembers. That's what makes this place so enduring. Not its legal status, but its memory. For those who lived near it, the glacier wasn't a blank space, it was a presence. A thing with moods and murmurs, something to be respected, but also used. It was dangerous, but useful. Cold, but somehow familiar. A neighbor, if not exactly a friend. And in times of war, even that quiet familiarity could become a kind of salvation. During World War II, there were instances, quiet ones, barely documented, of partisans using the glacier to evade patrols. A few scattered memoirs reference the high ice route as a way of slipping from one valley to another without encountering checkpoints. Again, it wasn't that the glacier was safe, it was just safer than the roads, safer than being recognized, safer than the certainty of being caught. That's the glacier's real power. It erases certainty, it makes you small, and in doing so, it lets you pass. Even now, as the sun slips lower and the shepherd continues down the slope with his goats, you sense that long tradition beneath him, the countless quiet crossings, the bootprints lost to snow, the whispered conversations that left no record. They've all been folded into the glacier like seeds in permafrost, waiting, preserved, not lost, not really. And now you know something that few hikers, tourists, or even scholars ever truly grasp. This glacier isn't just a note known by generations who lived alongside it, who crossed it without asking permission, who never needed maps to understand it. It may not belong to a country, but it belongs to memory. Yours now too. So the next time someone pulls out a clean, digital map of Europe and points to a clear, unbroken border in the Alps, you'll smile softly, you'll know better. You'll know about Emil, about smugglers with incense pouches, about shepherds with songs older than states, and about a glacier that slid through all of it, patient, silent, watching. Postal confusion in the glacier that never got mail. The clouds settle low over the glacier today, curling around the jagged rock spires and soft snowfields like cautious ghosts. You float above the ice, watching the morning melt begin to glisten along crevassed edges. There's no sound but the faint crackling of ancient pressure, a slow sigh from within the glacier itself. And somewhere below, in a modest stone building nestled at the edge of a mountain village, a postmaster is frowning at a letter. The envelope is damp around the corners, the ink slightly smudged, but it's still legible. The destination reads, Glacier Station, Alpine Research Facility, Austriatli border. The postmaster rubs his forehead because, once again, someone has tried to send mail to a place that technically exists but also doesn't. This is not the first time. In fact, confusion about how to route mail to research stations, shelters, and even temporary military outposts near the glacier has been a recurring problem since the late 1800s. The issue: the glacier doesn't have a consistent postal designation. Depending on which map is consulted or which country issued the latest zoning regulation, the glacier may fall under Austrian, Italian, or undefined jurisdiction. That's a logistical nightmare for any postal system, and this leads us straight into tonight's mainstream historical fact. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, famed for its multilingual bureaucracy and elaborate postal codes, struggled to administer high-altitude territories with shifting physical geography. In particular, its postal service, once among the most efficient in Europe, had no standardized method for delivering to zones defined by glaciers, especially those uninhabited in winter and inconsistently marked on official maps. The empire tried to solve this with bureaucratic flair. In 1894, the Imperial Postal Commission designated a new subcode for temporary or seasonal highland stations, identified by Roman numerals and altitude brackets. Glass-adjacent shelters were assigned codes like 28 alt 30 to 40. These were, unsurprisingly, ignored by nearly everyone outside Vienna. Locals continued using whatever town name was closest, and postmen known for their resilience but not necessarily their cartographic innovation, often tossed letters for glacial facilities into general delivery piles. Some mail reached its destination weeks late, some never did. This caused particular headaches for alpine scientists. During the early 20th century, Austria and Italy both operated small seasonal weather stations near the glacier, manned by rotating teams of meteorologists, surveyors, and occasionally unlucky military trainees assigned observation duty. These stations were supposed to receive regular mail-boat supplies and correspondence, but the question of whose post office should deliver to which station became such a political mess that one researcher wrote in 1923, "It is easier to measure snowfall here than to receive a newspaper." The situation worsened after the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, with new borders, reconfigured nations, and vague treaties defining post-war territorial divisions. Many old postal routes were scrapped or rebranded. By the 1930s, multiple Alpine research teams reported that supply boxes sent from Vienna were being intercepted by Italian border agents, who were unsure whether the packages violated customs regulations. One unfortunate crate of barometric instruments was held in a mountain depot for 6 weeks while bureaucrats argued over its national destination. That brings us to a quirky, lesser-known incident. In 1956, an Italian mountaineering club attempted to establish a semi-permanent hut near the glacier's southern slope. They requested postal recognition from the regional office in Boulder. The application was filed, reviewed, and denied not because of safety concerns or funding, but because the local government couldn't determine which country's mail service would be responsible. The hut was eventually built, but it never received official post. Instead, visitors were instructed to leave mail in a metal box nailed to the interior wall. Every 2 weeks, a volunteer would collect the letters and carry them down to the nearest town, where they were forwarded without return addresses. That's how one American climber's postcard, dated 1958 and addressed to his grandmother in Ohio, ended up arriving 3 years late, bearing a Hungarian postmark, despite never entering Hungary. The glacier, in effect, had become a postal black hole. This seemingly small detail carries a bigger question, and tonight's open scholarly debate in legal geography. What determines a location's postal jurisdiction map coordinates, administrative claims, or actual access? Theoretically, postal boundaries follow administrative ones, but in practice, especially in difficult terrain, access routes often determine who delivers what. If an Austrian trail is the only reliable way to reach a shelter even, if it's technically on Italian territory, should Austria's postal service be responsible? Or does national sovereignty override logistical practicality? Legal scholars remain divided. Some argue that mail delivery represents a form of soft sovereignty, meaning whichever state maintains that service reinforces its claim to the land. Others point to cases where postal neutrality has existed, like in parts of Antarctica, where international treaties allow multinational delivery based on convenience, not borders. The glacier, naturally, doesn't care. It continues to shift, expand, and melt, often rendering marked trails unusable from one season to the next. That's why, even today, some GPS-tagged coordinates for glacial huts are flagged as location may be approximate, which is the digital equivalent of a shrug. But this hasn't stopped people from trying. In the early 2000s, a group of environmental researchers from Salzburg installed a solar-powered weather monitoring station near the glacier's midpoint. They included a tiny metal mailbox, partly for equipment returns, partly as a joke. Inside it, they placed a laminated card that read, "Mail may be forwarded by whichever country gets here first." That station, like so many things on the glacier, vanished under a snowdrift 2 winters later and was never seen again. Somewhere beneath 10 feet of ice and silence, it might still be there waiting for a stamp. You float now lower, beneath the cloud line, where a handful of hikers clustered around a modern alpine shelter built by a local conservation group. One of them is holding a postcard. He asks the others if there's a place to mail it from the summit. They laugh. One suggests using a drone. Another says, "Just take a photo and send it digitally, it'll get there faster." No one offers an address, and in that moment you realize the quiet absurdity of it all. Here is a place where the world connects, but not officially, where people visit but no government fully admits it owns the welcome mat, where mail is written but rarely delivered, and yet it persists. The glacier does not care for stamps or zip codes, but it holds every undelivered letter, every dropped postcard, every laminated note asking, "Where exactly am I?" It collects them like snowflakes, layer upon layer, becoming not just a map of geography, but a slow archive of uncertainty, a library of never-mailed memories. And as you drift back upward, above the red flags, the slush-softened ridges, and the wind-polished ice, you smile at the thought, somewhere below, in a snowbank no one will ever dig through, sits a postcard from 1972, addressed to Glacier Station, Alpine Border, written in pencil that has long since faded. But the glacier remembers. It always remembers. Border treaties signed in snowstorms, The wind is rising again tonight, high above the glacial plateau, where the outlines of nations are nothing more than ideas buried beneath centuries of snow. You're drifting over a flat white expanse that looks, from here, like peace incarnate, no fences, no checkpoints, not even a signpost, just whiteness, stretching out to every visible edge. But beneath that gentle hush lies a story of paperwork and politics conducted in some of the worst weather Europe has to offer. Welcome to the world of alpine border treaties, some of which were negotiated, debated, or even signed while it was snowing hard enough to erase the very lines being discussed. It's a kind of diplomacy that exists not in grand chambers or glittering palaces, but in damp tents, over steaming mugs of coffee, with wind-rattling canvas and maps being held down by rocks. So tonight, let's unpack the long, strange tradition of glacial diplomacists, starting with the mainstream historical fact that even modern European borders, for all their presumed clarity, often rely on century-old documents that were written with a surprising amount of improvisation. You'd think something as important as national territory would be defined with laser precision and ironclad certainty. But in the Alps, many boundaries were sketched during or immediately after conflicts, often without full access to the terrain in question. In the aftermath of World War I, for instance, the Treaty of Saint-Germain in 1919 formally redrew borders between Austria and the newly expanded Italy, but the negotiators, working with incomplete maps and limited on-the-ground data, were forced to define certain high-altitude borders using phrases like along the ridge east of Peak X or following the line of glacial descent. These might sound reasonably until you realize glaciers don't stay still. So from the very beginning, the Alpine border was partly metaphorical. Italy, eager to solidify its new territorial claims, dispatched teams of military surveyors in the 1920s to plant stone markers along what they believed was the treaty-defined line. But some markers ended up hundreds of meters apart from each other due to difficult weather, poor visibility, or simple disagreement about where the ridge actually was. In one 1924 report, an Italian officer admitted that his team couldn't locate Peak X at all, so they guessed based on local shepherds' directions and the general shape of the clouds. That report was later archived with the annotation, approximate, but acceptable. The Austrians, for their part, were not particularly invested in correcting the boundary. Having lost a war and most of their empire, they had other priorities. And so, for decades, the border in these glacial zones remained based on rough sketches, physical markers, and treaty language that was about as firm as a snowball. This brings us to a truly quirky moment in glacial history, the 1952 Summit Agreement, signed during a winter meeting between Austrian and Italian officials at a remote alpine lodge halfway up the glacier. According to memoirs from those present, the Italian delegation arrived on skis, the Austrians by mule. The fireplace was already lit when they sat down. The coffee was spiked with schnapps, and the wind outside howled so loudly that they could barely hear themselves speak. The issue on the table: whether the seasonal retreat of the glacier had exposed new land that should be claimed or considered neutral. The Austrians wanted a survey. The Italians proposed simply agreeing to disagree. The resulting document was a masterpiece of ambiguity. It read, "The territory herein observed shall be considered of shared interest, pending further natural developments." No one was quite sure what that meant, but both sides signed it. The storm outside was getting worse. They had bigger concerns like whether the mules would survive the night. That document was never officially ratified in either country's parliament, and yet, to this day, it's occasionally cited in regional land use cases. The glacier, you see, is not just a slow-moving force of nature. It's also a loophole. And scholars have noticed, here's tonight's open debate: can environmental change, specifically glacial retreat, nullify or override the boundaries established by historic treaties? Some legal historians argue that borders set by natural features, rivers, ridges, glaciers, must adapt as those features shift. Others claim that the legal wording of treaties freezes the border at its original location, regardless of physical transformation. The Alpine Glacier Zone is a case study in this dilemma. Satellite imagery from the 2000s revealed that the glacier had retreated more than 200 meters since the original boundary markers were placed in the 1920s. In some spots, what was once Italian glacier is now a rocky field that technically lies within Austria's old surveyed zone. Does that mean the land has changed hands? Is sovereignty tied to the ice or to the rock beneath it? No one agrees. And so, rather than update the treaties, most regional officials prefer a quiet, unofficial solution: do nothing. As long as no one builds a hotel, opens a ski lift, or plants a flag, the glacier remains diplomatically invisible. That's the secret truth of many modern border disputes. They persist not because they are dangerous, but because they are inconvenient to solve. And so, the snow keeps falling. You glide now above one of the older border markers, lichen-covered stone post set into the edge of a crevasse. Its engraved letters worn down by wind and time. The marker is barely visible, a forgotten comma in a sentence no one finished writing, yet there it stands, a remnant of an agreement signed in a snowstorm, in a century that no longer exists. Below you, a pair of young researchers are using a GPS device to try to remap the old treaty line. They mutter about inconsistencies, about how their coordinates don't match the stones. One of them jokes, maybe the treaty was written by drunk cartographers. The other laughs, then carefully types something into a tablet. Boundary not verifiable, glacial interference. That's the modern version of approximate, but acceptable. And so the record continues. One more moment of uncertainty layered onto a glacier that has already buried 1,000. It's hard not to admire it. In a world obsessed with precision, here is a place that embraces imprecision as survival. Treaties signed in tents, borders guessed by clouds. Ice as arbitrator, snow as witness. It all feels like a dream, and yet it governs real land, affects real people, shapes real maps. Perhaps that's the glacier's deepest power. Not just its mass or motion, but its ability to humble human certainty, to remind us that sometimes, even nations have to squint through snowflakes and make their best guess. You float higher now, through the thinning clouds, above the zone of undefined treaties and silent agreements. The wind hushes slightly. Below, the glacier gleams somewhere far off. Another storm is forming. And here, nestled between sky and stone, you realize this is the only place in Europe where borders still get snowed in. The glacier that had no name for a while, the night sky above the glacier is unusually clear now, as if even the clouds have agreed to take a pause. Stars blink softly in place, and the long white surface of the glacier glows like the back of a sleeping whale. You drift lower again, floating quietly above the undulating curves of ice, following a path that once meant something to cartographers but has long since faded into obscurity. And here comes a rather unusual realization for a stretch of time decades. In fact, this very glacier had no name, not officially, not universally, not in the way maps like to pin things down. It was known by many names, none of them consistent, and some of them invented on the spot, which is both amusing and, for historians and bureaucrats, deeply annoying. So tonight, let's explore the strange case of the glacier that everybody recognized but nobody could quite name. Our mainstream historical fact is this: it's not uncommon for large natural features, rivers, peaks, deserts, glaciers, to carry multiple names in multilingual regions, particularly in Europe where political borders and spoken languages rarely match up. But the glacier in question took this to an entirely new level. Depending on who you asked between the mid-1800s and the late 20th century, it was called something different in German, Italian, Ladine, Slovenian, and even Latin. Was partly a result of Austro-Hungarian administrative sprawl. Officials based in Vienna often preferred classical or Latin-derived names, while locals in Tyrol or South Tyrol used dialect-based names that rarely made it into official records. In one particularly baffling case from 1872, the same glacier appeared in two different imperial survey reports under entirely different names, one calling it Glacialis Septentrionalis, Latin for Northern Glacier, and the other labeling it Schneebengletscher, which roughly translates to Snow Cluster Glacier. The reports were published within 6 weeks of each other. No one caught the duplication. When questioned later, the cartographer responsible for the second version reportedly said, "I did not think anyone would care what it was called, so long as they knew it was icy." Fair enough. That casual attitude toward naming persisted for decades, even within the Austro-Hungarian military. Map collections known for their obsessive detail, there were inconsistencies in glacial labeling. Some editions omitted names entirely and used only grid coordinates. Others assigned names that clearly didn't match local usage. This created a quiet kind of chaos. Local shepherds and mountaineers continued using names that had nothing to do with imperial records, while academics and bureaucrats debated spelling, etymology, and whether it even needed an official title. This ambiguity led to an amusing fringe historical moment. In 1928, a French alpine journalist writing for Le Monde de la Montagne visited the glacier and, confused by the inconsistent naming in various maps and guidebooks, dubbed it La Glacier, Fantomici Funam Glacier. The nickname caught on briefly among climbers, especially those fond of mysterious-sounding terrain. It even appeared in a few tourism brochures in the 1930s. One poster showed a dramatic ice field beneath swirling clouds, with the tagline, "Visit the Phantom Glacier if you can find it." Of course, that only deepened the confusion. Italian authorities didn't appreciate the ghostly branding and began quietly lobbying for an official renaming. But that raised an awkward diplomatic question. Whose right was it to name a glacier that technically sat on a poorly defined border, and whose language that should take priority? That's our quirky fact tonight. For nearly 40 years, various alpine organizations submitted name proposals for this glacier to national and regional bodies, none of which were ever approved. One proposal in the 1950s suggested naming it after a local poet who had written a sonnet about snow. Another group of Italian hikers wanted to call it Ghiaccio della Pace, Glacier of Peace, because it had never hosted a battle. The Austrian Climbing Federation, perhaps more practical, proposed simply using the grid designation Jet Deux and Quattro. None of these names stuck. And so, the glacier went through most of the 20th century as a kind of blank spot with nicknames. That brings us to tonight's scholarly debate. What does it mean, politically and culturally, to name or refuse to name a piece of land? Scholars in toponymy, the study of place names, argue that naming is a powerful act of claiming. When you assign a name to a landscape, you embed it within a language, a culture, and a historical framework. But when multiple names coexist, when none are universally recognized, the landscape resists being fully claimed. It remains liminal, ambiguous, free-floating. The glacier's namelessness became its own kind of resistance. In a region where nearly every mountain, creek, and hamlet has been carefully catalogued and categorized, the glacier stood apart, huge, visible, and yet undefined. That bothered bureaucrats but delighted poets. A 1971 essay in a regional mountaineering journal declared, "The glacier has no name because it refuses one. It is not ours, it is only passing through." Beautifully put. And yet this namelessness had real consequences. In environmental reports, researchers had to refer to it by coordinates or nearby landmarks. In legal documents, it was often left out entirely for fear of misidentifying it. Even rescue teams occasionally encountered confusion when referencing the area, leading to delays and crossed wires. Finally, in 1984, the Regional Council of South Tyrol, in coordination with Austrian and Italian geological institutes, issued a joint declaration. The glacier would henceforth be recognized as Glacierfeldreyfus, name chosen not for its cultural resonance but for its neutral origin. Dreyfus was the surname of a Swiss hydrologist who had mapped the area extensively in the 1930s and had no political affiliation with either Austria or Italy. The decision was meant to avoid favoritism. Ironically, Dreyfus himself had referred to the glacier in his notes simply as the ice sheet near the ridge. Today, the name is printed on modern hiking maps, though many locals still call it the Big White One or simply ours. A few holdouts still prefer Phantom Glacier, especially among the older climbing circles. But officially, it now has a title, one that took over 100 years to settle on. As you float lower, you spot a modern metal signpost near a trail junction. It reads, Glacierfeldreyfus, unstable ice. A small sticker has been placed beneath it, probably by a hiker. It says, still feels like a ghost, and maybe that's the truth of it. Some names stick because they're official, others linger because they're whispered. The glacier itself, of course, remains indifferent. It accepts the name like it accepts the snow, the sun, and the curious footsteps of those who come to see it. You pause here a little longer, listening to the ice creak softly beneath starlight, and imagine all the names it's been called, all the maps it's appeared on, all the blank spaces where someone simply wrote, Unknown Glacier. There's something peaceful about that. In a world that insists on naming, claiming, defining everything, it's comforting to find a place that refused. For over a century, this glacier wandered through maps like a phantom, impossible to pin down, and yet always right here. When weather stations played tug-of-war as the first golden sliver of morning light spills over the horizon, the glacier below begins its subtle shimmer, glittering like a hoarded secret freshly dusted with powdered diamonds. But the real story isn't in the shine. It's in the tall, metallic pole sticking awkwardly out of the snow about halfway down the slope, looking a bit like someone tried to plug a radio antenna into a glacier. There's a rusted weather vane, a half-frozen solar panel, and a faded label that once read Station Italia but now says only Station I_. And there, next to it just a few meters away, is another pole. This one is taller, newer, and very Austrian. Its label is bold, and the flag sticker near its base is unmistakably red and white. This surprise is not just a story about icy wind speeds or annual snowmelt. This is the story of a scientific turf war fought with thermometers. Welcome to the decades-long tale of overlapping weather stations on the unclaimed, uncertain glacier, where meteorology got personal and nations used temperature readings as subtle declarations of sovereignty. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Throughout the 20th century, especially in remote or politically sensitive regions, weather stations were often used as tools of soft power. Establishing a research outpost, however basic, was a way for a country to signal presence, interest, and sometimes control over a particular piece of land. In places like the Arctic, the Antarctic, and yes, the Alps, weather stations were planted like polite little flags. Science was the excuse, territory was the subtext. The glacier, predictably, became a favorite target. In the post-World War era, as tensions cooled between Austria and Italy but remained politely unresolved, both countries began funding small-scale scientific operations in the high alpine zones. Weather was a useful entry point. It didn't require large infrastructure. It served public interest, and it allowed visits by researchers without raising military eyebrows. Between 1958 and 1983, at least 5 different weather stations were built on or near the glacier by various institutions, some Italian, some Austrian, and at least one that tried to be neutral by claiming to represent an international consortium that, in reality, was mostly funded by Tyrolean cheese cooperatives. Let's talk about one in particular, Station Alpengro, an Austrian-funded automatic weather post installed in 1976. It was equipped with a temperature sensor, wind vane, and snow depth gauge, powered by a solar panel and serviced by alpine volunteers. At first, everything went smoothly. Data was collected, analyzed, and shared with regional meteorological bureaus. But in 1981, Italian researchers set up a station just 40 meters away, slightly higher up the slope. They called theirs Vetta Bianca White Peak Station and insisted it was located entirely within Italian jurisdiction. The Austrians disagreed. The two stations began recording similar but subtly different data. When discrepancies arose, each side accused the other of calibration errors. The Italian team argued that their higher elevation gave them better accuracy. The Austrian team countered that snowdrift patterns interfered with the Italian instruments. Then, sometime in late 1983, things took a humorous but revealing turn. The Austrian station's wind vane was mysteriously rotated 180 degrees, a prank, perhaps, or sabotage. No one took credit. The Austrians realigned it and installed a small camera. A month later, the Italian station's snow gauge was found buried unusually deep, as if snow had been deliberately shoveled on top. Again, no culprits. The Glacier weather wars, as they were jokingly dubbed in an article by a German climate journal, continued with minor incidents for nearly a decade. Most were harmless, some were petty. One Italian technician reported finding a note stuffed into the battery housing of his station, written in German, that read, "Nice try. Still Austria." These pranks never escalated into serious conflict. But they underscored a key point. When you can't settle ownership with law or maps, you might try it with rainfall sensors. That brings us to tonight's quirky fact, one whether the station was accidentally claimed by both nations on official government websites for 3 full years. In the early 2000s, a set of digital updates to regional climate maps led to a fascinating overlap. The same GPS coordinates belonging to an old partially buried weather post were listed in both Austrian and Italian scientific directories. Each claimed operational status. Each listed its own technicians. Journalists eventually noticed. One called it the world's loneliest diplomatic dispute over barometric pressure. After much back and forth, both governments removed the station from their online maps. The physical pole, still present but corroded, remains a symbol of that moment. Data without a country. And now to the deeper scholarly debate. Does the sustained operation of scientific infrastructure in disputed or ambiguous territory constitute an act of sovereignty? This question, raised frequently in international law, is especially potent when it involves peaceful civilian activities. A weather station is not a fortress, but it can still imply ownership. Legal scholars are divided. Some argue that these acts are simply scientific in nature and shouldn't be interpreted as political. Others point to legal precedents where continuous maintenance of infrastructure at stations, trails has been used to justify territorial claims. In the case of the Glacier, neither Austria nor Italy has officially used a weather station as evidence in any sovereignty debate, but both have used the data in regional planning and emergency response, which implies a kind of jurisdiction. In essence, the Glacier became a stage where science and statecraft performed a very polite dance, each pretending the other wasn't watching too closely. You float now a little lower, drifting past one of the still operational weather posts, its tiny solar panel catching early light. A lone technician is present today, checking readings with frostbitten fingers. He wears no national insignia, just a jacket with a patch that reads Alpine Climate Initiative. When asked where he's stationed, he shrugs and says, "Up here." That's as specific as anyone gets. And maybe that's enough, because despite the quiet tug-of-war over instruments and readings, the Glacier doesn't mind. It holds the data. It shrugs off the flags. It lets everyone have their measurements, but it gives no answers. Not about ownership, not about borders, just temperature, just wind, just snow. You float upward again, watching as a gust of wind tips the older weather vane slightly to the west. Perhaps a tiny protest. Or maybe just weather, doing what it always does, ignoring us all. Skiers, scouts, and accidental diplomats sure hovering now above a gentle ridge just south of the glacier's belly, where the snow is soft and pliant under a rising midday sun. The landscape stretches like an open invitation. No fences, no barriers, just slope after slope of white and silence. But that silence is occasionally broken by a laugh, a shout, the distant swish of skis gliding over powder. Because believe it or not, for decades this very glacier, despite its legal ambiguity, was a recreational hotspot for those brave enough or oblivious enough to ignore the blurred border it sat on. And tonight, you're going to meet the skiers, the scouts, and the accidental diplomats who turned a disputed glacier into their private playground, one winter at a time. Our mainstream historical fact. Between the 1930s and the 1970s, mountaineering and winter sport clubs across Europe boomed in popularity, especially in alpine nations like Austria, Italy, and Switzerland. Skiing was not only a fashionable leisure activity, it was also considered wholesome, invigorating, and strongly associated with national pride and physical fitness. Clubs from Vienna to Milan organized regular winter expeditions, many of them focused on challenging or remote locations. and the glacier offered both dramatic terrain and a thrilling sense of remoteness. So, naturally, it attracted attention. The first documented skiing expedition across the glacier dates back to 1933, led by a group of Viennese students known informally as the Wiener Schneegeister, the Vienna Snow Ghosts, their trip journals, to reveal a kind of gleeful defiance. One wrote, "We crossed 3 nations before breakfast and none of them noticed. They skied up from the Austrian side, cut across the glacier, and descended into an Italian valley where they bought bread and cheese before returning the same way." It wasn't political, it was practical, and it set a precedent. Through the 1940s and 50s, other clubs followed, often treating the glacier as a kind of lawless passageway, an alpine Narnia where you could ski uninterrupted by customs officers or border patrols. These early ski adventurers weren't reckless. They were simply operating in a gray area where no one seemed to mind. And that's where things get quirky. One local legend involves a group of Italian Boy Scouts who, in the summer of 1955, camped just east of the glacier's peak to earn their wilderness and exploration badges. Their leader, a former army sergeant with a passion for maps, realized partway through the trip that they had pitched their tents in Austrian territory. Panicking slightly, he decided to move the entire camp 200 meters southwest in the middle of the night to avoid diplomatic incident. Of course, no one official ever noticed, but the scouts later reported the midnight migration as their most thrilling memory of the trip. This blend of quiet trespass and innocent misunderstanding continued well into the 1970s. Small alpine shelters, many of them unofficial, were built along the glacier's edge by hiking clubs, sometimes without asking permission from either government. One such hut, known locally as Casa di Nessuno, Nobody's House, became a favorite spot for overnight stays, even appearing in word-of-mouth travel guides. It had no heating, no insulation, and no foundation, just wooden walls and a crooked chimney, but it was famous among ski mountaineers for the guest book it kept, where visitors would leave messages like, "Crossed 3 times, still haven't found the border." These informal crossings eventually drew attention not from soldiers, but from scholars, and that's where tonight's open scholarly debate comes in. Can unofficial recreational use of disputed or undefined territory shape long-term perceptions of ownership? Some cultural geographers argue yes. When people repeatedly cross camp, ski, or hike in an area without interference, they begin to treat it as theirs, even in the absence of formal recognition. This phenomenon is sometimes called soft occupation, not enforced with weapons but boots and backpacks. Others disagree, pointing out that governments rarely concede territory based on tourism. But even these skeptics admit that consistent, peaceful use of ambiguous zones can complicate later legal negotiations. The glacier then became a case study in this phenomenon. When asked in a 1988 survey which country the glacier belonged to, a surprising number of frequent hikers and climbers said, "Whichever side I entered from." They weren't being sarcastic, they genuinely didn't know, and didn't care. For them, the glacier wasn't national, it was personal. And this vagueness sometimes led to oddball diplomatic moments. In 1992, during an international youth ski exchange program, a group of German teenagers accidentally skied into the heart of the glacier from the Italian side, spent a night in one of the makeshift shelters, and were met the next morning by an Austrian rescue team who had tracked them via satellite beacon. No one was in danger. The teens were simply lost and cold. But when their location was formally logged, it sparked a brief jurisdictional scuffle. Italy insisted the teens never left Italian soil, while Austria claimed the rescue occurred entirely within Austrian territory. The event made local news for exactly 1 day before being replaced by weather updates. Still, it highlighted how even the most innocent crossing by tourists, scouts, or skiers could briefly awaken the sleeping questions beneath the snow. Yet, despite these tensions, neither country ever tried to restrict recreational access. There were no warning signs, no passport checks, and certainly no fences. The prevailing attitude seemed to be, if you're willing to haul skis up here, you've earned the right to slide down wherever you like. The glacier, in turn, played host without prejudice. It accepted every boot print, every ski track, every breathless tourist selfie with the quiet stoicism of ice that has seen centuries come and go. Today, remnants of that recreational past still exist. You float now over the crumpled roof of Nobody's House, collapsed in a storm some years back but still recognizable. A few sun-bleached planks lie in the snow like old bones. There's a rusted thermos lid nearby, a scattering of cigarette butts from an era when climbers smoked at elevation. Nearby, someone has scratched a message into a flat stone slab. Border. What border, man? Perhaps that's the glacier's final joke. For all the skiing, camping, debating, and surveying, the ice never declared a side. It let everyone visit but gave no one a deed. It was host, not owner, playground, not province. And maybe that's why it remains so beloved, not in textbooks or treaties, but in stories told around campfires, in scuffed-up trail journals, and in the faded Polaroids tucked into the pages of Alpine Club newsletters. The glacier belongs to whoever remembers it, to whoever risked the climb, to the kids who skied across nations without knowing it, and the scout leader who thought he'd sparked an international crisis by sleeping in the wrong snowbank hover now as another pair of skiers appears below, gliding silently across the lower field. Their laughter rises faintly into the air, bright and distant, and the glacier listens, as it always has. Maps that lied in the glacier that didn't wind up here has taken a quieter tone tonight. Brushing the snowy surface of the glacier like a sleepy sigh, you drift through a stillness so deep it hums. Beneath you the ice lies solid and ancient, unmoved by centuries of scribbled human guesses about what goes where, and that's precisely what this part of the story is about. The maps, more specifically, the maps that lied or at least fumbled the truth, and the glacier that kept on being exactly where it had always been, unbothered by ink and borders and names that changed every other generation. Tonight, you'll trace a trail of paper mistakes, cartographic ambitions, and the persistent stubbornness of one patch of ice to be anything other than itself. First, the mainstream historical fact. Before the satellite age, the Alps were notoriously difficult to map with precision. Peaks obscured other peaks. Snowfields blended into clouds, and glaciers constantly shifting, melting, growing, and reshaping refused to offer the consistent landmarks that cartographers relied on. Add to this the political changes of the 19th and 20th centuries, especially in the Austro-Hungarian and later Italian regions, and you've got a recipe for cartographic chaos. The glacier at the center of our story, sometimes drawn large, sometimes small, sometimes not, it all became one of the Alps' most inconsistently rendered features. Take, for instance, the 1869 Imperial Alpine Survey conducted under the command of Archduke Johann of Austria. It was ambitious, beautifully detailed, and full of hand-inked flourishes. It also completely misplaced the glacier. One version of the map shows it flowing north into a valley it has never touched, cutting across a range it physically cannot reach. Why? A surveying error caused by cloud cover, an inexperienced assistant, and a compass malfunction. The map was printed in large numbers and distributed across military outposts and alpine clubs, which led to decades of hikers being surprised by either the absence or presence of a glacier where their map said one shouldn't or should be. Later maps tried to fix it, but often disagreed. Italian versions from the early 1900s show a dramatically shrunken glacier, perhaps to minimize its intrusion into what they considered Italian territory. Austrian versions, by contrast, made it look larger and more robust, as if to bolster claims to a terrain that was literally melting away. One map from 1911 even gave the glacier a bold outline and labeled it strategic frozen terrain, a phrase that sounds both ominous and suspiciously bureaucratic. And here's your quirky fact for the night. In 1927, a French expedition attempting to cross from the Austrian side to the Italian side used a newly issued Panalpine collaborative map that showed the glacier as a safe traversable field. It wasn't the glacier had fractured that season due to a hot summer, and what was drawn as a smooth slope was, in reality, a mess of crevasses. The team fell into one and had to be rescued 2 days later. Their leader later wrote in his journal, "The glacier was honest, the map was not." Which brings us to the deeper debate among scholars. How much do maps reflect the real world, and how much do they shape it? Cartographers will tell you maps are never objective. They reflect the priorities, assumptions, and sometimes propaganda of the cultures that make them. In this case, border tensions, national pride, and inconsistent surveying technology all played a part. Some argue that early 20th century maps of the glacier were intentionally misleading, either to justify territorial claims or to discourage cross-border travel. Others suggest it was simply the result of poor coordination between alpine nations that were, at the time, more focused on rebuilding after war than syncing topographic data. Either way, the result was the same. Maps that disagreed with each other, disagreed with reality, and often disagreed with themselves. One particularly striking example comes from 1953. When a team of Italian geologists published a beautiful fold-out glacier map in Rivista Geografica Italiana. The colors were vivid, the contour lines precise, but an Austrian team pointed out something odd. The map's glacier center point, marked with a red dot, was located on bare rock. When questioned, the Italian authors admitted they hadn't visited the site in person. They had, instead, compiled data from various older maps, none of which agreed. It was, they said, a best guess. The glacier, of course, paid no attention to these guesses. It continued to move, slowly, silently, and sometimes mischievously. During a particularly cold stretch in the early 1960s, the glacier expanded enough to cover a previously exposed ridge that served as a key reference point for several local trail maps. The change confused hikers for years, especially those relying on photocopied guides from older editions. One climber later told a radio interviewer, "We thought we were in Italy. Then we were told we were in Austria, but then we found out we were in a snow cave and didn't care anymore." That story made national news briefly and inspired a regional joke. Where are we, wherever the snow says? By the 1980s, with satellite imagery becoming more accessible, the discrepancies began to narrow. Scientists could finally track the glacier's movement, size, and melt patterns with unprecedented precision. But even this didn't fully settle the debate. As it turned out, not all satellite maps agreed either, not due to politics this time, but due to how different imaging software interpreted the glacier's edges. Was that bright patch an icefield or a snowdrift? Was the rock outcrop permanent or seasonally exposed? Debates erupted not just in geography departments but in national parks offices, tourism boards, and even postal route planning meetings. And yet, through all of this, the glacier remained remarkably constant, not in shape or size, but in its quiet refusal to confirm anything. It wouldn't tell you whose land it occupied. It wouldn't align with your red dotted lines. It wouldn't make a noise when your coordinates said here, and somehow, that stubborn silence became its truest feature. You float lower now, over a weathered trail marker made of stone, once embedded in permafrost and now tilted at a strange angle. The marker bears an inscription half faded, mostly covered in lichen. It says, "Map says yes. Glacier says maybe." There's a walking stick prop next to it, abandoned long ago. The ice has crept up the shaft, as if slowly claiming it. Further downhill, two modern hikers are staring at their GPS devices. One points north, the other west. Their conversation is full of half-laughs and frustrated sighs. And behind them, rising without comment, is the very glacier they're trying to place. It doesn't speak, it doesn't help. It just sits there, ancient, indifferent, impossibly large, and lets them fumble. You drift above them, quiet as ever. In the distance, the wind flips open a page of a trail guide someone dropped. The page flutters, torn and snow-smeared, its map lines curling in the cold. Another lie, perhaps, or just a guess, made obsolete by nature itself. Frozen artifacts and the bureaucrats who argued over them as twilight glazes the horizon with pale blue and lavender. The glacier begins to resemble a polished relic, still, remote, and hiding things it has no intention of surrendering easily. You drift lower, your gaze following the gentle arcs and jagged ridges until your eyes settle on something oddly rectangular poking out from the ice. It looks like wood, maybe a piece of a crate, warped by moisture and age. A few feet away, something glints metallically, half swallowed by snow. And suddenly, you realize you're looking at one of the glacier's most controversial habits, coughing up historical leftovers just often enough to start arguments, but rarely enough to solve anything. Tonight's tale. The frozen artifacts accidentally revealed by this slow, silent behemoth, and the bureaucrats who tied themselves in knots trying to decide who owned what, when, and why. First, the historical fact. Glacial melt, particularly in the Alps, has led to a dramatic increase in archaeological discoveries since the mid-20th century. As ice recedes due to climate shifts, it reveals remnants of human activity that have been sealed away for centuries. Even millennia, everything from Roman sandals and Bronze Age tools to 20th century military gear. The most famous example is See the Iceman, found in 1991 in the Etzdal Alps. A discovery that not only thrilled scientists but triggered a heated border dispute between Austria and Italy over the exact location of his body. And this glacier was slightly mischievous. Legally murky glacier has had its own share of revelations. Starting in the 1970s, hikers and researchers began finding objects poking out from the summer-melted edges. Bits of leather, iron buckles, buttons, fragments of wooden skis, even cloth that had somehow survived intact. One of the earliest significant finds came in 1979 when a team from a university mountaineering club stumbled upon what they thought was a rusted toolbox. When they pried it open, they found surgical instruments, 19th century military issue, complete with a broken bone saw, and a handwritten note in faded ink. The note, it turned out, was a field medic's log from 1859, referencing the Second Italian War of Independence. That war saw fierce skirmishes across the Alps. Though this particular glacier had never been officially documented as part of any campaign, yet here it was physical proof that someone, likely Austrian or Piedmontese troops, had crossed or camped on the ice during the conflict. The find was sent to a museum in Bolzano for analysis. But this kicked off a debate that still hasn't been fully settled. Italy claimed the discovery as part of its national patrimony, arguing that it had been recovered on the Italian side of the glacier. Austria disagreed, citing older maps that placed the find squarely within Tyrolean territory. Neither side budged. The artifacts were eventually placed on rotating displays, alternating between museums in South Tyrol and Innsbruck, with each side presenting slightly different captions. The Austrian version described the tools as remnants of imperial medical practice. The Italian version labeled them evidence of early Italian military resilience. The truth, of course, is no one really knows who left them. That brings us to tonight's quirky fact. In 1994, a group of amateur climbers discovered a half-intact sled buried just beneath the surface. It was made of pine, roped with sinew, and tied to what appeared to be a canvas duffel bag frozen solid. Inside the bag were tins of food, one of them still labeled in faded German, Leberwurst -1915. There were also 2 empty wine bottles, an Austrian military map, and a harmonica. Scientists dated the items to World War I, when high mountain patrols occasionally crossed glacial passes on reconnaissance missions. But the harmonica, it was stamped with the words "Made in Milano." And so, again, the question emerged: who had been there? and more importantly, who now had the right to claim what was found. Which brings us to the open scholarly debate. How should artifacts found in ambiguous or disputed zones be classified legally? International cultural heritage law often dictates that artifacts belong to the country in which they are discovered. But in cases like this, Glacier where borders are blurry, and maps disagree, such policies can become absurdly complex. Some argue for joint stewardship. Others suggest that the objects themselves, especially if associated with military campaigns, belong to the nation whose history they most directly represent. In practice, this has led to dozens of meetings, memos, academic panels, and even temporary storage neutral zones where artifacts are held until both sides reach agreement. You might think this only happens with ancient relics, but even relatively recent discoveries have sparked contention. In 2006, a partially exposed canvas backpack was found near a ridge popular with hikers. Inside was a journal written in elegant Italian, detailing an attempted summit in 1937 by two young climbers from Trento. The entries ended abruptly on the fourth day. Nearby, researchers found bones, hiking boots, and what was eventually confirmed to be the remains of one of the climbers. The Italian press reported it solemnly as the return of a lost son of the mountains. But Austrian outlets pointed out that the remains were technically found within Austrian map coordinates. It didn't become an international incident, but it did spark weeks of editorial sparring between regional newspapers. Meanwhile, the glacier continued to melt, and more objects continued to emerge. An old pocket watch, a rusted bayonet, a sealed envelope containing pressed flowers, and a love letter addressed to M. No one knows if M ever read it, but it now sits in a climate-controlled box in a South Tyrolean archive, occasionally exhibited under the title Frozen Affections. And that's perhaps the most human element of this story. The glacier, for all its legal ambiguity and scientific fascination, has quietly become a gravekeeper, a time capsule, a reluctant museum. It has no interest in politics, no bias in ownership. It simply preserves what it swallows and offers it, back when it feels like it. Some years it offers nothing, other years it gives up reminders of wars, romances, accidents, or vanished adventures. These objects arrive without context, just fragments of lives interrupted. You glide lower again, watching as a team of archaeologists gently chip away at an icy corner where a leather strap protrudes. They move carefully, reverently, no one speaks. Every item recovered sparks paperwork, arguments, and usually some mild diplomatic fuss. But before that, before the flags and legalese and museum glass, it's just a moment of recognition. A thing once held by a hand, now released by a glacier. You hover a little longer. Below you, a frozen photograph lies face down in the snow. Someone will find it. Someone will wonder, and maybe, just maybe, it will rewrite one more footnote in the long, unfinished story of a glacier that never forgot. The glacier election that wasn't this evening deepens over the ice. A faint blush of violet brushes the horizon, and the last golden rays slip like silk behind jagged alpine peaks. The glacier, as always, seems uninterested in the affairs of humans, but tonight we're stepping into one of its most unintentionally comical chapters. Imagine, if you will, a group of well-meaning politicians, local council members, bureaucrats, and mountain folk standing on snowdrifts with clipboards, arguing politely, furiously over how to conduct an election in a place that no one can definitively say belongs to them. No, this isn't a satire, this really happened. And tonight, we're diving into the surreal case of the glacier election that wasn't. First, let's lay down the mainstream historical fact. In most European regions, voting districts are meticulously drawn along municipal or provincial boundaries, which are clearly defined on maps and codified in law. But in border zones, particularly ones with active disputes or ambiguous definitions, things get creative. This becomes especially thorny in mountain regions where population centers are sparse. Terrain is inhospitable, and nobody really wants to admit that a glacier might technically be part of someone's voter roll. The trouble began in 1997, when the South Tyrolean Regional Council undertook a routine administrative update. The goal was to modernize polling station designations, align district maps with new topographical data, and, ideally, prepare for a seamless rollout of the upcoming national elections. Straightforward enough. But when the committee began reviewing satellite overlays, they noticed something odd. A small segment of what they labeled Precinct 4 be extended northward onto the glacier itself. Why? Because a decades-old topographic map, digitized without context, had misclassified the slope as settled land, likely due to historical survey errors and overlapping skiing trails. In other words, the glacier, uninhabited, icy, and legally ambiguous, was assigned a voter population of approximately 6. Those 6 people, of course, did not live there. They lived in a nearby Italian hamlet and had no idea their ballots were technically assigned to a snowfield. Once discovered, the error should have been easy to fix. But it wasn't, because, as it turned out, correcting the boundary would require both Italian and Austrian agencies to sign off on a formal map revision. And that's where it got complicated. But Glacier had never been officially divided in legal terms. It was governed by overlapping jurisdictions, unspoken agreements, and a healthy dose of don't ask, don't tell between the two nations. No one wanted to set a precedent by formally redrawing a border, even for something as minor as a precinct map. That's where the quirky fact comes in. At one point, the Regional Election Committee considered placing a temporary polling booth on the Glacier itself just to technically fulfill the requirement. Seriously, there were actual printed minutes from a 1998 meeting where the suggestion was floated to airlift a small, heated tent to the lower Glacier Ridge for symbolic voting compliance. A regional contractor even drafted an estimate for generator-powered heat lamps, ballot boxes with snow-sealed lids, and a portable satellite uplink for real-time vote tracking. The proposal was eventually shelved not because it was illegal, but because it was, as one council member put it, preposterously stupid. Instead, they filed a temporary exception with Rome, classifying the zone as geographically isolated and climatically restricted, which is a bureaucratic way of saying no one wants to ski up here to vote. Still, the issue lingered. Each election cycle, the maps had to be revised manually to exclude the glacier, a task that fell to increasingly confused interns. In 2002, one such intern accidentally included the glacier again, triggering a brief moment when it technically appeared in two precincts at once, an error spotted by a university student browsing open-source election data. The student emailed both national election offices asking, "Does this mean the glacier gets 2 votes?" She received no reply. And now for tonight's scholarly debate. What happens when political representation and physical geography don't match? Political scientists have long debated the role of representational voids, areas that fall within a legal system but don't correspond to human populations. Some argue these voids are irrelevant, mere cartographic footnotes. Others believe they pose real risks, potential loopholes, legal uncertainties, or even sites of exploitation. In the case of the glacier, the risk was minimal. No one was using it to rig elections or hide votes. But the symbolic absurdity struck a chord. Editorials emerged with headlines like "Can Ice Cast a Ballot?" and "Frozen Democracy, the Alpine Voting Dilemma." Comedians joked that the glacier leaned while others said it voted abstain by default. Meanwhile, in back offices and legal departments, quiet discussions continued. What if, one day, someone did try to claim residency there? After all, a makeshift hut or temporary research station could, in theory, be declared a permanent dwelling. It wouldn't be the first time someone gamed zoning laws to claim representation. That hypothetical was never tested, but it led to a fascinating 2005 legal memo drafted by the South Tyrolean Council, which explicitly stated, "No individual shall be granted voting privileges based solely on seasonal or scientific presence within the glacial zone." A glacier-specific voting clause. Just imagine that in a constitution. Still, the topic never quite disappeared. In 2011, a local satirical party printed campaign posters that read, "Even the glacier knows who to vote for." The slogan was a hit, and hikers took selfies with the posters along mountain trails. One enthusiastic voter even snowshoed up to the glacier and planted a mock ballot box labeled "Official Voting Igloo." The stunt made the regional news, and the glacier, once again, played its part posing silently in the background while humans laughed at themselves. You hover now over that same ridge, watching the moonlight stretch its silver fingers across the ice. There's no sign of ballot boxes anymore, only a faint depression in the snow where perhaps someone once stood with a clipboard, questioning their life choices. A soft wind picks up. You imagine it carrying the whispered opinions of every rock, ridge, and snowdrift. Elect nobody. Vote glacier. Because in the end, this icy landscape remains impartial. It doesn't favor a party. It doesn't redraw lines. It doesn't file paperwork. The glacier doesn't participate, but its very existence challenges the neat boxes we try to put the world into, and maybe, in a strange way, that makes it the most honest voter of all. Flags in the snow. When ceremonies got awkward, the stars above you now glint like frost caught in lantern light, scattered across the sky in brilliant silence. The glacier below lies untouched for the moment, its rippling surface sculpted by the cold and lit faintly by moonlight. You drift lower, across a stretch of ice so flat and wide it resembles a frozen stage. And it's on this accidental platform that some of the most awkward diplomatic ceremonies you've never heard of took place. This isn't a tale of grand treaties or historical pacts. No, tonight we're talking about ribbon cuttings with no audience, flag plantings that stirred silent protests, and official speeches given to an audience of snowflakes. This is the history of ceremonial gestures on a glacier that couldn't care less. Our mainstream historical fact for tonight: it's not uncommon for governments to use symbolic ceremonies, especially on contested land, to quietly assert control. In international relations, it's called performative sovereignty, and while it rarely changes legal status on its own, it signals intent. You build a monument, you hold a ceremony, you plant a flag. It tells the world, we're here. During the 20th century, especially after World War II, both Austria and Italy engaged in these quiet symbolic gestures across border regions. And yes, the glacier found itself repeatedly swept up in these gestures, sometimes willingly, sometimes just because it was the nearest flat patch of nowhere that nobody had a permit for. Let's begin with a snowy day in 1951, when an Italian Alpine brigade staged a commemorative ski march across what they believed to be Italian highland terrain. At the midpoint of their route, just near the glacier's crest, they paused, formed a loose semicircle, and hoisted a small Italian flag on a fiberglass pole. There was no press, just a photographer, a few solemn officers, and the wind. The moment was captured in black and white, the soldiers standing proudly while their breath fogged the frozen air. The image later appeared in an army newsletter under the headline, "Guarding the Heights, Our Watch Continues." But that flagpole didn't last long. 2 weeks later, a pair of Austrian hikers found it, took it down, and left behind a note that read in German, "Wrong hill. Try again." They also planted their own flag, an Austrian Tyrolean one, with a decorative pine cone tied to the top for flare. And so began what some locals now call the flag season. Through the 1950s and 60s, planting and replacing flags on the glacier became an odd, semi-official ritual. Neither country formally acknowledged it, but local military units and alpine clubs quietly competed to see whose flag would last longest. Some got buried by snow, others were blown off by wind. One, reportedly, was stolen by a marmot, though that might be a poetic exaggeration. The result, a kind of frozen tug-of-war with polyester and symbolism. That brings us to tonight's quirky fact. In 1974, a local Austrian mayor attempted to hold a citizenship ceremony on the glacier for his newborn grandson, whom he proudly declared the first true citizen of the high ice. The idea was to symbolically link the family to the disputed zone by conducting the event in a place where no one could legally object. He brought a folding table, a flag, two witnesses, and a baby wrapped in 4 layers of wool. Unfortunately, mid-ceremony, a dense fog rolled in and the group got lost for 3 hours. The baby slept through the whole thing. Later, both the Italian and Austrian governments quietly asked the mayor to never do that again. Of course, ceremonies weren't always initiated by locals. By the 1980s, European integration movements had started taking an interest in the Alps as a symbol of cross-border unity. Several regional groups made up of artists, scholars, hikers, and people who just liked flags began organizing what they called unity marches. These were well-meaning hikes that culminated in multilingual speeches about friendship and cooperation, often held on or near the glacier. One of the more famous of these happened in 1987 when Italian and Austrian officials met near the southern edge of the glacier to sign a friendship scroll, which was then placed inside a waterproof capsule and buried beneath a stack of commemorative stones. Both delegations gave short speeches in the cold, took photographs, and sipped lukewarm wine. It was all very heartfelt until someone pointed out that the chosen burial spot might not technically fall within either country's mapped territory. The capsule has never been recovered, which leads us into tonight's open scholarly debate. Do symbolic actions carry legal weight in places without settled jurisdiction? International law typically requires sustained recognized presence for territorial claims, think outposts, infrastructure, or permanent populations. But ceremonial acts, like planting a flag or holding a speech, occupy a gray zone. Some legal theorists argue they serve as soft claims, which may be used to bolster future legal arguments. Others dismiss them entirely, noting that modern international courts prioritize treaties and functional control over symbolic gestures. The Glacier, of course, does not recognize gestures. It ignores symbolism. It eats flagpoles. But the people who care about such things keep trying. As recently as 2008, a group of university students held a neutral ice peace walk, culminating in the planting of a white flag stitched with the word "maybe." Their manifesto, written in 5 languages, declared the glacier a zone of ambiguity and gentle mystery. It was left in a glass box on a snowbank. The box vanished within a month. Today, only scattered remnants of these past ceremonies remain. You float past a barely standing post, splintered and tilted, its flag long gone. A plaque sits beneath it, etched in both Italian and German, but the words have been scraped away by wind and time. All that remains is the date, 1983. No one remembers what it was for, and yet, hikers still pause there. Some take photos, a few leave stones or pine cones as offerings, not because they understand what happened, but because they recognize that something did. You glide gently now across the snowfield, passing over another faint depression where someone once unfolded a table, gave a speech, or made a vow. There's no applause, no spotlight, just the soft hush of snow settling in, reclaiming the platform with every flake. Maybe that's the glacier's final word on ceremony. If you must make gestures, do so knowing they will be forgotten. If you must plant flags, know they will fall. And if you must speak, do so to the wind. It's the only audience guaranteed to stay. Flags in the snow. When ceremonies got awkward, the stars above you now glint like frost caught in lantern light, scattered across the sky in brilliant silence. The glacier below lies untouched for the moment, its rippling surface sculpted by the cold and lit faintly by moonlight. You drift lower, across a stretch of ice so flat and wide it resembles a frozen stage. And it's on this accidental platform that some of the most awkward diplomatic ceremonies you've never heard of took place. This isn't a tale of grand treaties or historical pacts. No, tonight we're talking about ribbon cuttings with no audience, flag plantings that stirred silent protests, and official speeches given to an audience of snowflakes. This is the history of ceremonial gestures on a glacier that couldn't care less. Our mainstream historical fact for tonight. It's not uncommon for governments to use symbolic ceremonies, especially on contested land, to quietly assert control. In international relations, it's called performative sovereignty. And while it rarely changes legal status on its own, it signals intent. You build a monument, you hold a ceremony, you plant a flag, it tells the world, we're here. During the 20th century, especially after World War II, both Austria and Italy engaged in these quiet symbolic gestures across border regions. And yes, the glacier found itself repeatedly swept up in these gestures, sometimes willingly, sometimes just because it was the nearest flat patch of nowhere that nobody had a permit for. Let's begin with a snowy day in 1951. When an Italian Alpine brigade staged a commemorative ski march across what they believed to be Italian highland terrain. The midpoint of their route, just near the glacier's crest, they paused, formed a loose semicircle, and hoisted a small Italian flag on a fiberglass pole. There was no press, just a photographer, a few solemn officers, and the wind. The moment was captured in black and white, the soldiers standing proudly while their breath fogged the frozen air. The image later appeared in an army newsletter under the headline, "Guarding the Heights, Our Watch Continues." But that flagpole didn't last long. 2 weeks later, a pair of Austrian hikers found it, took it down, and left behind a note that read in German, "Wrong hill, try again." They also planted their own flag, an Austrian Tyrolean one with a decorative pine cone tied to the top fore flare. And so began what some locals now call the flag season. Through the 1950s and 60s, planting and replacing flags on the glacier became an odd semi-official ritual. Neither country formally acknowledged it, but local military units and alpine clubs quietly competed to see whose flag would last longest. Some got buried by snow, others were blown off by wind. One, reportedly, was stolen by a marmot, though that might be a poetic exaggeration. The result? A kind of frozen tug-of-war with polyester and symbolism. That brings us to tonight's quirky fact. In 1974, a local Austrian mayor attempted to hold a citizenship ceremony on the glacier for his newborn grandson, whom he proudly declared the first true citizen of the high ice. The idea was to symbolically link the family to the disputed zone by conducting the event in a place where no one could legally object. He brought a folding table, a flag, 2 witnesses, and a baby wrapped in 4 layers of wool. Unfortunately, mid-ceremony, a dense fog rolled in and the group got lost for 3 hours. The baby slept through the whole thing. Later, both the Italian and Austrian governments quietly asked the mayor to never do that again. Of course, ceremonies weren't always initiated by locals. By the 1980s, European integration movements had started taking an interest in the Alps as a symbol of cross-border unity. Several regional groups made up of artists, scholars, hikers, and people who just liked flags began organizing what they called unity marches. These were well-meaning hikes that culminated in multilingual speeches about friendship and cooperation, often held on or near the glacier. One of the more famous of these happened in 1987 when Italian and Austrian officials met near the southern edge of the glacier to sign a friendship scroll, which was then placed inside a waterproof capsule and buried beneath a stack of commemorative stones. Both delegations gave short speeches in the cold, took photographs, and sipped lukewarm wine. It was all very heartfelt, until someone pointed out that the chosen burial spot might not technically fall within either country's mapped territory. The capsule has never been recovered, which leads us into tonight's open scholarly debate. Do symbolic actions carry legal weight in places without settled jurisdiction? International law typically requires sustained, recognized presence for territorial claims, think outposts, infrastructure, or permanent populations. But ceremonial acts, like planting a flag or holding a speech, occupy a gray zone. Some legal theorists argue they serve as soft claims, which may be used to bolster future legal arguments. Others dismiss them entirely, noting that modern international courts prioritize treaties and functional control over symbolic gestures. The Glacier, of course, does not recognize gestures. It ignores symbolism. It eats flagpoles. But the people who care about such things keep trying. As recently as 2008, a group of university students held a neutral ice peace walk, culminating in the planting of a white flag stitched with the word "maybe." Their manifesto, written in 5 languages, declared the glacier a zone of ambiguity and gentle mystery. It was left in a glass box on a snowbank. The box vanished within a month. Today, only scattered remnants of these past ceremonies remain. You float past a barely standing post, splintered and tilted, its flag long gone. A plaque sits beneath it, etched in both Italian and German, but the words have been scraped away by wind and time. All that remains is the date, 1983. No one remembers what it was for. And yet, hikers still pause there. Some take photos, a few leaf stones or pine cones as offerings, not because they understand what happened, but because they recognize that something did. You glide gently now across the snowfield, passing over another faint depression where someone once unfolded a table, gave a speech, or made a vow. There's no applause, no spotlight, just the soft hush of snow settling in, reclaiming the platform with every flake. Maybe that's the glacier's final word on ceremony. If you must make gestures, do so knowing they will be forgotten. If you must plant flags, know they will fall. And if you must speak, do so to the wind. It's the only audience guaranteed to stay.